Tried to make it as fun as I could for my son. Leaf piles, rocks, jumping over sidewalk cracks, just trying to keep my frustration from showing, really. We live near the end of our street. Not a cul-de-sac exactly, but the road ends in a three-way stop that slows traffic to almost nothing. People do cut through sometimes, strangers mostly, and I hadn't gotten used to not watching them too closely yet. That morning, a man with a backpack walked past us. Early 30s maybe, bundled up even though it wasn't even cold outside. He didn't look at us. He just headed toward the stop sign and turned the corner. A few minutes later, he came back. Same pace, same direction. He didn't seem lost, just moving with the lazy, drifting stride that he was moving with. He walked our street again, made the same turn, disappeared, and then returned again. And again, and again. By the fourth pass, something about him had shifted. He wasn't glancing around anymore. He was watching, tracking, like he had picked out something and was deciding what to do about it. I felt that cold, deep gut warning, the one that doesn't speak in words but just pressure. I scanned escape routes. I could get over the back fence, but not while carrying my son. I could run across the road, but we would be in the open there. I tried not to let my breathing change. On the next loop, the man paused near the stop sign. Instead of turning, he stepped behind the only tall tree on the corner, just enough to break line of sight. I didn't hear a sound, I only saw the absence. Something inside of me said move, and I walked a few steps to angle myself just enough to see past the trunk, and he was digging through his backpack. Not rummaging, but deliberate, slow, like he had practiced what he was about to pull out. I then called my neighbor, barely keeping my voice steady, and asked if her husband could come outside right now. I kept my son on my hip, his cheek warm against me, and tried not to run. The neighbor's front door opened, and the man stepped out from behind the tree. And he wasn't holding a backpack anymore. Instead, he had what looked like a machete. Not raised high, just sort of held loosely, like someone carrying groceries, completely casual. He looked at my neighbor's husband, then at me, then at my son. That tiny half smile appeared, that kind that isn't happiness, but just decision. I didn't think. I just ran. I crossed the road so fast that I barely remember my feet hitting the ground. My neighbor caught my son from my arms before I even hit their steps. The man didn't chase, but he moved, closing the distance. The machete now lifted just slightly, like he was trying to feel the weight of the moment. He stopped at the street, not because of fear, I would guess, but more like he was measuring something. The space, the attention, the witnesses. His face was blank, not angry, not frantic, but just empty. We watched him walk back down the road. Same path, same pace, like the earlier laps had been practiced. The police, they came later, but he was already gone. I still think about the way that he walked that pattern, though, over and over again, until the moment that he obviously felt ready, like he was waiting for there to be no door behind me, no keys, and nowhere to run. These days, though, I keep keys in 3 different places now. One in the stroller, one in the diaper bag, and one hanging by the back door at all times. I don't like to stand outside with my son for too long now out there as well. Some people say to trust your gut, and I would agree with that after this experience. It was late September, but the nights had already taken on that early winter bite that comes fast in the mountains here. My friend, Mara, and I had planned a night away from town, mostly to breathe, but partly to use the new telescope that she had saved for. Both of us had spent a good portion of our lives outdoors. She grew up camping in that region, and I worked teaching people how to not get themselves killed in remote environments. The woods, for us, have always been more familiar than unsettling. The place that we were heading to It wasn't an official campground by any means, just one of those little clearings off of a forest road where maybe a truck or a fire ring have been before. Nothing special, but certainly high enough up in the mountains to get some dark skies. We were talking quietly as we climbed higher, just the usual conversation that you have when the world's fading behind you, when I noticed something off of the road. There was a tent, about 50 or 60 feet from the tree line. No vehicle, no bikes, no gear scattered outside, just the tent sitting there, looking like someone put it up in a hurry. The fly was loose and the shape just didn't look quite right too. I mentioned it to Mara and she slowed the truck. We didn't stop fully, just enough to glance, enough to register that the zipper looked partly open. The temperature was already around upper 30s, which is cold enough that an unprepared night could turn pretty dangerous. So we agreed to check it out on the way back home. A minute or two later, the road narrowed and the angle steepened a bit. Mara hesitated, not physically startled, but uncharacteristically unsure. She stared ahead at the bend and said quietly, "Let's go back. I don't want to go higher tonight." She couldn't explain it, and she didn't joke about it either, and something in her tone made me not question it too. So we turned around, and when we came back to where the tent had been, or where I thought it had been, it was now closer to the road, maybe 30 feet closer, or maybe a little bit less, but my memory told me one thing and my eyes told me something else. I assumed that I must have misjudged the position the first time. People misremember distances all the time, right? But when we stopped and we looked more carefully, the tent just didn't look right. It looked distorted, like it had been put together incorrectly. Poles bent out of alignment, the fabric pulled or warped at angles, and it seemed twisted. I tried to focus on it, but every time that I blinked, something about its shape sort of seemed to rearrange itself almost. It almost seemed like it was moving, or more like my eyes were failing to assemble it into a coherent object. Then, less than a second, I thought that I saw bare legs inside, bent upward like someone was lying on their back with their knees raised. But as soon as I consciously registered it, the shape resolved into darkness again. The mesh door looked zipped now, or maybe it always had been. I cannot say for certain. Both of us felt unsettled though, not scared, but weighed down by a vague, wrong-footed tension, I guess. We didn't discuss it, we just kept driving. When we reached the clearing further down, we got out and started setting up, and this is where the night shifted in ways that I still struggle to really describe logically. So we both tripped multiple times, not on roots or gear, but just walking on level ground that we could see clearly. Like our feet landed half an inch lower than expected, or we'd leaned too heavily on a step that shouldn't have caused any imbalance. It wasn't dramatic, but just sort of off, I guess. Like the ground wasn't matching our preconceived ideas of it. The air at ground level was warm too, warm enough that lying on a blanket felt comfortable, even though the ambient air was so much colder. Like, to the point where either of us stood up, the temperature difference was immediate and sharp, like stepping out of a sauna and into a refrigerator. Mara worked with the telescope for a long time, trying to track Jupiter. Each time she got it into view and stepped away for a few seconds, the planet just wouldn't be where it should have been. Not just drifted slightly, but gone entirely from the eyepiece's field. I tried too with the exact same result, and it was weird. Then, the sky itself seemed divided. A perfectly straight east-west line, one side slightly brighter and the other darker. The stars on each side flickered differently, and when one of us pointed it out, the contrast would flip, genuinely like watching a photo negative invert slowly. We didn't feel afraid then, but just deeply aware of being in a place where something was behaving differently and supernaturally, really. Time passed quietly, and I must have started to drift off towards sleep when Mara suddenly sat up. She had seen a light back in the direction of the tent. and it was way too high up to be a flashlight beam cast by somebody walking. I said that it was probably the camper that we assumed was there earlier, but she didn't respond. I don't know how much time went by, but eventually I opened my eyes again and I saw 3 lights, evenly spaced, just above the tree canopy. They moved slowly, but they rotated around each other as they moved forward, like fireflies except steady and deliberate. The color was not candlelight or LED headlamp white. It was sort of a dull bluish tone, faint but unmistakable. And it was then that I felt something that I had only ever felt once before in my life. The overwhelming instinct to leave immediately without analyzing whatsoever why. Mara felt it too, and we moved at the same time, silently gathering everything without folding or packing anything. Telescope thrown into the truck bed, blanket balled and tossed, doors slammed and gravel kicked. Neither of us spoke until we were back on the highway, and when we saw another car's headlights coming toward us, just an ordinary person going wherever people go at night, the tension, it broke at once, and we both literally started shaking. We drove home in near silence that night too. We never did report it. I mean, what do you say about something like this? There were no shapes, no creatures, no voices, just a series of small, precise wrongnesses that stacked into something neither of us could justify, along with some strange lights in the sky. But it's the tent that bothers me the most now, and not the lights, because a tent is simple. Poles, sleeves, stakes, seams. I mean, there's no reason that it should have been so difficult to visually comprehend that. There's no reason that my brain should have failed to recognize its form. And there's also no reason that I should have seen someone inside one moment and nobody the next. I've tried to explain it away. Temperature inversion, visual fatigue, atmospheric distortions, all plausible on their own for sure, but I have spent my entire life, adult life anyway, outdoors, and I know what the wilderness feels like when it's just itself. And this was not that. I still don't know what happened that night, or have a name for any of it, but whatever it was not normal. Minnesota isn't often the setting for stories that people tell, but I guess that's what makes it all that much stranger when something unexplainable does happen. So I grew up visiting the northern woods, the kind of place where lakes glimmer silver under a low sun and pine trees stretch endlessly, swallowing all sound. Most of the time, it felt safe, almost boring in its consistency. But not this time. This happened about a year ago. My brother and I had planned a day hike along the Superior hiking trail, starting at a trailhead just north of Tofty. The day before, things had already felt off. We'd made a late-night detour in Duluth to grab snacks, and our motel seemed a bit unusual, I guess. Shadows moved across windows where no one should have been, and the faint murmur of voices in empty hallways made me feel a bit uneasy. But we laughed it off as just city weirdness. Although, I must say that I did feel uneasy about it, and something was lingering with me. In any case, we began hiking at around 7:30 in the morning. The air was crisp, heavy with pine and the faint tang of water from Lake Superior. At first, everything was great. The trail rugged, as it should be, with steep grades and winding paths. We passed a few groups, including some college students enjoying a leisurely stroll, their laughter drifting across the forest. The hike itself was physically challenging, but it was manageable. We talked about life too, about past mistakes, and we shared small jokes to keep our spirits up. After roughly 4 or 5 hours, I would say, we reached the Lutzen Lodge, a point where we planned to turn back. But that's when the trail began to, well, for a lack of a better term, behave strangely. You see, we started back along the path, but something had changed. It was subtle at first. Our pace felt normal, but the forest seemed I don't know, thicker, as if the trees had shifted closer together. Shadows stretched differently here. The sounds of wildlife were muted or missing entirely, it felt. The college students that we had passed on the way in were now gone, vanished, though the trail ahead was clear and well marked. Then we noticed the mushrooms, just hundreds of them, scattered along the mossy ground, spiraling in colors and shapes that I had never seen in this region. Some of them even seemed almost luminescent. My brother stopped to snap a photo, but his phone refused to turn on. I tried mine, but the screen flashed and just went black. Well, we continued, feeling the forest press in on all sides and feeling a bit weird about it. At one point, we returned to a section that we had passed hours earlier, a clearing with a fallen birch. My brother checked his watch and, "What time do you think it is?" he asked. I calculated in my head, using the pace and the distance that we had covered. Probably about 4 p.m. We should probably speed up to get out of here before dark." He frowned. "No, it's 1:15. I laughed nervously. "You're joking, right?" But he wasn't. Somehow, though we had been walking slower than on the way in, we had crossed ground that previously took 2 hours in just one. The sun's angle didn't match the time on his phone at all, and even the trail seemed slightly rearranged. Like familiar landmarks looked different. Trees and rocks were in places that I swear that they shouldn't have been. Like I said before, too, the forest had gone completely silent now. No birds, no rustle of small animals, not even the wind anymore. It was like the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and it makes you question if sound even exists at all, until you speak, that is. Well, we passed the same places repeatedly, though they weren't identical and there were subtle shifts that just sort of disoriented us, I guess. Finally, though, we emerged at the trailhead, 2 hours ahead of when we expected, even though we had walked slower and stopped several times to make sense of the trail. The cars in the lot were exactly as where we had left them, but everything just felt sort of unreal, like we had moved through a forest that existed out of sync with time itself. We left in silence, driving back to the motel. Duluth felt bright and ordinary, almost painfully mundane after the forest, but I've hiked that trails many times since then, and I've never again had an experience anything like that. Sometimes I wonder if we slipped into a small fold in reality, or if the forest itself keeps its own rhythm, unnoticed by those who walk it. I still see those mushrooms in my mind from time to time too, glowing faintly under that impossible canopy, and even now I hesitate to hike that place alone. The woods are beautiful there, but that day reminded me that some places just seem to have rules that we don't understand. And that time, it certainly felt like the forest was not what it seemed. I don't usually share stories like this. I mean, most people just roll their eyes when you start talking about strange things that happen in the desert. They assume it's the heat, or maybe exhaustion, or just too much alcohol, or whatever. That's probably fair, to be honest, for most of the time, but what my old co-worker told me years ago has stayed with me ever since, and he certainly wasn't the kind of man who exaggerated. So I met him while working construction near the Four Corners, somewhere out between Shiprock and the Arizona line. His name wasn't really Cujo, but that's what everyone called him. He was part of the Navajo Nation, quiet, steady, and tough as nails. He had that look of someone who had seen some bad things and didn't bother talking about them. He told me about this story one night after work, though, when a few of us were sitting outside passing a six-pack around and just talking about all the things that had happened out there. Lights that move wrong in the sky, sounds that carry for miles that seem weird. Cujo didn't really usually join in, but for some reason that night, he chose to. Now, he said that had happened years before, after a fight with his wife. He had been working a 12-hour shift that day, and He came home bone tired and they argued about money or something small that got way too big, and he decided to cool off before saying anything worse, so he grabbed a pack of beer, got into his old truck, and he drove out. Now, the roads out there stretch on forever. Long, thin lines of dust through desert and scrub, and he said that he wasn't even sure where he was heading. He just wanted to be alone under the stars for a little bit. Eventually, he found a side of the road that cut uphill toward a mesa, the kind of road that looked like it hadn't been used in years. He followed it anyway. At the top, he parked and climbed into the truck bed with his beer. The desert at night is a bit of a strange thing for anyone who hasn't been there. Wide open, but a little bit claustrophobic all at once. He said that it was quiet except for the wind and the occasional crack of the cooling metal from the engine. But then he heard something. It wasn't an animal that he recognized. Not a coyote and not a wild dog. It was distant but sharp, like a cry or maybe a wail. It echoed through the basin, rose and then faded again. He froze for a little bit, waiting to hear it again. And when he did, it was closer this time. Hearing that, he got back into the truck and he shut the door, trying to shake the sound out of his head. He turned on the radio, but the signal wouldn't hold. Static crawled over every channel and the cry came again. This time closer again, and longer this time, and he said that it was almost like something imitating a human scream. Well, he started the engine and drove down the dirt road faster than he probably should have. The truck bounced and rattled over the rocks. He said that he kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see headlights or movement, but there was nothing. Just the black desert and that sound behind him now getting closer. He came around a bend and he then slammed on the brakes because there was a man standing in the road, holding a shotgun. Cujo said that the man didn't look angry, but just tired and sort of serious. He motioned for him to stop. Cujo hesitated, then rolled the window down an inch. "Get out of the truck," the man said. "You shouldn't be out here alone." At first, Cujo thought that it might be a setup. Maybe someone trying to rob him or mug him or take his vehicle. But there was something in the man's voice, a calm that just didn't match the situation. He pointed the shotgun not at him as well, but toward the horizon. "You hear it too?" the man asked. Cujo nodded. The stranger told him to follow him back to his house. It was nearby apparently, down a barely visible dirt track that wound between two hills. Cujo didn't really want to, but he didn't want to drive into the dark again either by himself, not with that noise echoing closer and closer. So he followed. The house was small and low, just 2 rooms, a tin roof, a single porch light that flickered a bit. Inside was an older woman sat near the stove, and 2 children peeking out of the back room. The man told Cujo to sit and offered him some water. No one really spoke much after that too. They all just sort of sat there listening. The sound came again, circling the house this time. And that was when he also heard heavy footsteps in the dirt, then a scraping sound against the wall of the house. The woman whispered something in Navajo, and one of the kids started crying softly. The man loaded another shell into his shotgun, but didn't go outside. Cujo said the thing, whatever it was, apparently kept moving around the house until the first hint of dawn, and then it just suddenly stopped. Not faded, but stopped like it just disappeared. When he left the next morning, the man walked him back to the road and he said only one thing before turning away. "Don't follow the sound when you hear it. It wants you." Cujo told us that he never saw that man again. In fact, he went back weeks later and he could never find the dirt track that led to that house. Which was a little bit weird, he said, but it was also probably just the fact that it was dark and he could probably never find it. In any case, he laughed after telling the story, but not in a way that made it sound funny, but more like someone trying to shake something off that just wouldn't leave him. I never worked with Cujo again after that job ended, but every now and then I drive through that part and I think about him, about that road and the way that he said that the noise just didn't sound like an animal or a person, but like something that was trying to sound like both. And I mean, that's pretty creepy, right? When I was younger, there was this stretch of road everyone in Farmington talked about, but never admitted being scared of. Crouch Mesa. It wasn't haunted in any sort of official sense, but everyone seemed to have a story about strange lights or tall figures moving along the ridgelines at night. Most of us just brushed it off. I used to drive that road all the time alone too, and I never saw a thing. Well, not until the summer that I turned 17 anyway. It was late August, and I had gone with my friend Sean like we always did. We didn't really care about baseball. I mean, it was just more about getting out, watching the crowds, maybe talking to someone new. The night felt normal enough too. Warm, quiet, and no drama. But when we left the fairgrounds, something told me to take the long way home, through the old roads east of town. Sean complained, said that he wanted to go home, but I told him that it'd be quicker. It wasn't. After 20 minutes, we were out where the pavement turned to patchwork, and it was part asphalt, part dirt. It's the kind of road that hums around your tires a bit and really isn't all that safe. I could see the faint glow of the city far behind us now, and ahead, just the dull silver of moonlight over the brush. Nothing was really moving, and it was just the two of us in this car out there. I slowed down at the four-way crossing, one paved, 3 dirt roads disappearing into nowhere. I don't know why I stopped, habit maybe I guess, but I had been ticketed a few months earlier for running a stop sign there, and my mum nearly killed me over it, so I waited there longer than I probably needed to, hand on the gear shift, when Sean leaned forward suddenly and said, "What's that?" I thought that he was joking again. He did that constantly. Fake panic, sudden shouts just to make me swerve. But this time his voice was flat and tight. I turned to snap at him, but then I looked back at the road, and that's when I saw something too cross the intersection. At first, I thought that it might have been a cow. I mean, people let their livestock wander near the mesa sometimes, but this thing moved wrong. It was upright too, broad and way too big to be a man. It didn't run or limp or move like anything that I'd seen before. Just steady as if it knew exactly where it was going. The shoulders, though, were huge, wider than the doorframe of the truck easily, and even though it passed through the beam of my headlights, the details just didn't make any sense to me. It was like trying to focus on a face in a dream, where the features just kept shifting. "Go," Sean whispered. Then louder, "Go!" I pressed the gas hard. The truck fishtailed in the dirt road before catching grip. We tore down the road, neither of us speaking, just the sound of the gravel hitting the undercarriage. After maybe a minute, he told me to slow down and to stop, said that he thought that he saw it again. I hit the brakes, the headlights cutting across the brush, dust spilling absolutely everywhere in the air. And there it was again. Off to the right this time, standing at the edge of the road, not moving, just turned slightly, like it was watching us. The moon hit it at an angle, enough to outline the shape, and it was at least 7 feet tall, maybe more, long arms and a huge chest. It wasn't a bear, mind you. I mean, I grew up around this land, and I know what a bear looks like, and this just wasn't that. I rolled the window down without even realizing it. And the air smelled awful, like metallic or rain on dry dirt, and except the sky was clear and this smell was disgusting. Then, in the silence, there was this low sound, not quite a growl, but more like a deep vibration, so low that I could feel it in my stomach. And then, the next thing that I remember clearly is that we were just halfway back to town. I don't remember turning the truck around. I don't remember the first 10 miles. Sean said later that we both went quiet at the same time, and he thought that I was just driving in a trance. The clock on the dashboard said 2:47 in the morning, and we had left the game before midnight. When I dropped him off, neither of us really said much. He just sort of stood there staring at me like he wasn't sure if we'd actually come back from something or if something had happened. I told him to call me in the morning, but he didn't. In fact, we didn't speak for a week. At night, though, I just sat on the porch outside, and my clothes just sort of smelled like dirt and the metallic smell from earlier. I didn't sleep that night. I just kept checking the road, half expecting to see headlights or someone standing at the edge of the driveway, and weirdly it was like I was just so anxious and I was sweating. The next day I went out to look at my truck. The passenger side mirror was cracked clean down the middle too, like it had been struck by something. Mind you, there was no sign of impact anywhere else, just that mirror. I never did tell anyone except Sean, and for a while I convinced myself that it was nothing, a trick of the dark and nerves, or maybe some weird desert animal that walked on two legs for a few seconds. But years later, when I was in Washington for Air Force training, I heard another guy from New Mexico talking about something that he had seen near Crouch Mesa, and his description was almost word for word what I had seen. I didn't join the conversation, I just sat there and listened to it. But man, it made me feel really uneasy hearing that again, and it brought the whole thing back for me, and it's something that I don't think I'll ever forget. I used to spend a lot of time in the woods when I was younger. Back then, I believed that the woods were just trees and dirt and moss, a place to gather mushrooms, breathe some fresh air, maybe feel like a woodland fairy for a few hours. I was 19 when it happened, old enough to think that I understood danger, but still young enough to laugh at goosebumps. My friend and we had gone out early in the morning, the sun still low enough to make everything look washed out in pale gold. We moved deeper into the forest than usual, where the ground was uneven and the air smelled sweet and old. There were supposed to be some mushrooms that time of year, and I remember being so focused on scanning the ground that the rest of the world just sort of slipped away. I thought that I saw a cluster of yellow near a fallen log, the kind that hides partially under leaves. I leaned in, narrowing my eyes to make out the shape. I stepped closer and closer. My attention tunneled, and for a moment it felt like the entire forest held its breath with me. Then my eyes adjusted, and I realized that the shape that I had been studying wasn't mushrooms at all. It was a face. A person was standing just beyond the brush. Close, way too close. He blended in so well that I hadn't recognized him until I was practically in reaching distance. His skin was mottled with shade, clothing earth-colored, still as dead bark. His eyes were wide and bright, fixed on me with an expression that I remember as not as emotion, but almost as expectation. He smiled without showing teeth. Then he lifted one hand, very slowly, very softly, and curled his fingers toward himself, inviting me closer, as if I already belonged to him and just needed reminding. I stood there with just his hand and his smile, and my heart beating into my ribs like it was trying to escape without me. I didn't scream, I didn't even react at first. It was like my mind just sort of lagged behind what my eyes were seeing. I don't know how long I had been walking toward him, but I also don't know how long he had been waiting there for me to notice. When my body finally caught up, I spun and ran. My friend called after me confused, and I grabbed her wrist so hard that she yelped. I didn't explain, and we just ran until we could see the path again. We laughed about it then, dismissed him as some weirdo. We even finished our mushroom hunt not too far away, because teenagers think that they're invincible, right? But the years after have changed that memory. The older I get, the more details I remember. Like the way that he didn't blink, the way that he seemed almost placed there, like he had been waiting for someone, The way that I never heard him move, breathe, or exist until he wanted me to. Sometimes I wonder if he was following us before I even turned toward those mushrooms. Sometimes I wonder if he had been there every time that we had come to the forest, watching and waiting until one of us got close enough to notice him. And sometimes when I remember how his hand moved, I wonder what would have happened if I had just taken one more step closer. I certainly would have been within reaching distance then. Those woods I refuse to go back to now, and I haven't been back there for many years. When you grow up somewhere small enough that everyone knows your last name, you start to think that danger is something that happens elsewhere. Bad stories are for bigger cities, places with highways and hotels and strangers who never look at you twice. Where I'm from, the roads end quickly, the houses sag into fields, people nod at you even though they've never spoken to you before. It was, for all intents and purposes, safe. I was 17 then, still juggling school and my first real job at the only fast food place that stayed open late. A dull little Burger King that had fryer oil everywhere and exhausted people working for it. I didn't have a car, but I lived close enough to walk, and my dad always said things like, "This town takes care of its own." It sounded comforting at the time, I guess. That night, it was like every other. Burnt patties, sticky drink machines, customers who acted like minimum wage meant servitude. My shift ended at 11, and I stepped outside into air that felt way too quiet, like the night wasn't breathing, and the walk home was pretty much routine. Down the main road, past the old playground, then a left where the houses got older and the streetlights became more suggestion than illumination, I guess you could say. I had walked that path so many times that genuinely I probably could have traced it blind. Anyway, halfway home I noticed someone coming from the opposite direction, which wasn't unusual. People still cut through that way after work or drinks, and I couldn't see his face, just the outline of him against the dim road, but I really wasn't worried about it. But the moment that he realized that I had seen him, he seemed to stop. Not froze, but stopped with purpose. Then he slipped, or almost folded into the hedge beside the sidewalk, like he had done it before, like he knew exactly how to disappear into that particular bush. Honestly, I didn't know what to make of it. But there was the faint shake of branches, a sort of low rustle, and the bush was directly in front of the usual turn that led to my street. It definitely felt like an ambush. My body reacted before my mind did. I kept walking, steady, then veered off onto a different road without looking back. I didn't want him to know that I knew. I didn't want to acknowledge him and give him a reason to move. But then he called out. His voice carried across the empty dark. Hey, wait! I just need help with something." I didn't answer. I didn't even turn. But he must have seen the way that my shoulders stiffened, because I heard the fast crunch of gravel behind me. He was running. That was the moment that fear became something solid for me. And my legs, they moved faster than I knew that they could. The only thought in my mind was home. Not even safety, but just home. I heard him gaining, his footsteps uneven like he hadn't expected me to run that fast. I didn't look back, I didn't need to. I could feel him there, just behind the space that my shadow should have been. My house finally came into view. I fumbled keys, nearly dropped them, shoved the door open so hard that it banged the wall. I slammed it shut and locked it just as something brushed the outside doorknob. There was no knock, no shout, just silence, like he was on the other side of that wood, thinking. I sat there too, on the floor with my back against the door until dawn came. I tried telling myself that I must have just misunderstood him, that maybe he really did need help or something, but a few days later, I overheard students whispering in the hallway. One of the girls at my school had nearly been pulled into a car by a man who had followed her home or something. The description of him was pretty vague, but The shape of the story was very similar to mine. It was the same pattern, a similar route, a person learning who walked alone and when. And I realized then that he hadn't been surprised to see me that night. In fact, in hindsight, it seemed like he had been waiting for me. I don't walk at night anymore, and I don't assume that small places mean safe places anymore either. I also don't believe, not even for a moment, that danger is something that happens elsewhere any longer. Sometimes it already knows your name, apparently. It already knows your route home. And sometimes it's been waiting a long, long time, it seems. I used to think that the woods near my home were familiar in a way that a bedroom is familiar. You don't question the shape of the dark because, well, you've lived beside it your whole life. Even in the winter, when the snow muted every sound, those trees felt like a kind of shelter, a place that I could disappear into without being seen. I was 14 during that strange winter, when school was half computer screen and half desks spaced 6 feet apart. The house was always way too loud, doors closing, voices echoing, everyone restless and irritated. I had a performance piece due for theater class, something dramatic, something that required shouting. I didn't want to do that inside with everybody listening, so I stepped out into the cold and decided that I would run my lines out in the woods where the air felt open and indifferent. My sister, she walked with me to the back steps but stopped just before the tree line. She hugged her coat tight and stared into the woods like she was looking for something that she expected to see. "I don't want to go in there today," she said. No explanation. Then she turned and left quickly, like she couldn't stand to have her back to the trees that day. It certainly unsettled me, but I brushed it off. I called for my dog instead, a round little pug who was friendly to a fault. He almost never barked, and he practically loved every living thing. He followed me into the snow like he always did, trotting along my side as if the cold didn't even bother him. The woods, they were quiet that day too. Even the birds seemed to be sleeping. In any case, I started practicing, walking a familiar trail, recording myself to watch later. My breath hung in the air like pale smoke drifting upward between the tree branches. It was only when I stopped to review the video that I noticed movement behind me. There was a figure standing still. My first thought was tree, then no, that's a person. And then, why are they even here? Nobody ever walked those woods. It was private land, and certainly not during a deep freeze like this when the air felt sharp enough to cut your skin. I turned fully, expecting maybe that I had imagined it. But no, somebody was there, wrapped in layers of mismatched winter gear, coats over coats, torn fabric tied around limbs, snow crusted along the helms, and their face was mostly covered except for their eyes, which were startlingly uncovered and very direct, like they weren't trying to hide that they were looking at me. They were holding something long and metallic in one hand. Not a knife, not exactly, but something sharpened for sure. My dog, the dog who loved everyone, he stopped walking, his body went rigid, and then he barked. Now, I had never heard him bark before like that, not once. It was a raw, terrified sound that didn't sound like it belonged to him at all. His eyes were fixed on the figure, and for the first time I realized how still the woods had become. The person tilted their head, slowly, way too slow. Then they laughed. Not loudly, but just enough to feel personal, I guess. "I'm not worried about that one," they said. Their voice hoarse, like unused vocal cords had to relearn the shape of words. There was no reason to say that, mind you. No reason to address my dog at all. But the tone made it so much worse. I started walking, fast and not running. My dog moved backward while facing them as if he couldn't stand to turn his back. I could hear the soft crush of snow behind us, the rhythm of steps matching ours just a little bit faster, like they were studying just how far to close the distance was. Then they began to follow. I didn't think. I grabbed my dog into my arms and I instantly ran. Branches snapped against my coat, my lungs burned from the cold. The footsteps behind me sped up and there was no attempt to hide the sound now. I kept running until I hit the place where the path dropped off, a steep embankment, or more like a shallow cliff really, formed by years of snowfall and melt. I didn't have time to choose. I didn't have time to breathe. I jumped. Soft snow swallowed us whole, and it was cold, and it was wrapped around my legs in biting needles. And for a moment, I couldn't move at all. It was like the earth had swallowed me, or at least the lower half of my body. When I finally surfaced and looked back, the figure was stood above, scanning the tree line with a hand raised to shield their eyes, as though sunlight could possibly be bright enough to require that. When they spotted me, they didn't chase. They just started walking. Not rushed, not frantic, but just calm, with certainty. Like they knew exactly where I would come out. I clutched my dog and I ran again. I didn't feel the cold anymore. I could barely feel my legs even. I didn't feel anything but the pressure of moving and just trying to get out of there. I burst out of the woods eventually and into my yard like surfacing from a nightmare. I went inside and instantly shut the door, but I didn't cry. I didn't say a word, in fact. I just sat in my room with my frozen clothes melting into the carpet and stared at the wall while my dog pressed his body against mine without making a sound. I looked out the window a few times, but whoever was out there, they were now gone. There are some moments in life that you don't fully understand as frightening until a little time has passed. In the moment, it just feels uncomfortable, like you've walked into a room where someone was talking about you and they stopped too quickly. Your brain tries to rationalize first, and it only panics later. Well, last winter, I was heading home from a late shift. I work evenings at a clinic and I don't clock out until close to midnight. It had snowed earlier that day, just enough to make the roads look dull and grainy under the streetlights. My fuel light came on halfway home, but I figured that I could make it the last mile to the station near my neighborhood. I'd done it before, in fact. Unfortunately, though, I was wrong. About 4 blocks from the gas station, my engine coughed once and then just died. Everything around me went quiet, except for the heater fan slowly losing power. It was one of those residential streets too, where most of the houses are dark after 10 p.m. The street lamp on the corner, it had burned out weeks ago, so the only light was this dim glow from my dashboard. I put my hazards on and I called roadside assistance. They told me that it would be around 30 minutes to get there, which was annoying, but not the end of the world, I guess. Anyway, eventually a porch light flicked on across the street, and a middle-aged woman stepped outside in a cardigan, arms folded against the cold. She didn't come too close, just far enough to talk without yelling. She asked if I needed help, and I told her the situation. She nodded and said that she'd keep an eye out from her window in case anything happened. It was strangely comforting in that small-town way that people look out for each other, even if they don't know your name. Cars did pass occasionally. A few slowed, asked if I was okay, and they just kept moving. Then a truck rolled up and stopped in front of my car. No headlights, no signal, just stopped. But the engine kept running, and I locked my doors automatically like muscle memory. The truck sat there for several seconds, I would say, before somebody got out. Hood up, hands in pockets, walking with that slow, deliberate stride that people use when they want to seem casual but are also watching you closely. He came right to my window. I lowered the glass only an inch or two, just enough to not look hostile, and he asked if I wanted to wait in his truck so that I wouldn't freeze. I told him that I had help on the way. He leaned closer, like he didn't quite believe me, His face stayed in the shadow, but there was this long pause where neither of us spoke, and it was really awkward. I could hear the engine behind him rumbling. His breath clouded the tiny gap in the window. Then I heard it, the faint metallic click of my door handle being tested. Not yanked and not forced, but gently tested, like he was checking to see if he could skip asking. Before I could react, the porch woman's voice cut through the silence. She shouted something that I couldn't make out, sharp and steady, like she was scolding a dog that knew better. The man didn't respond, didn't turn, just walked back to his truck, got in, and drove off without headlights on, the engine fading down the street, slow and unhurried. She stayed with me then, not hovering, but certainly just present, standing a few feet away with her arms crossed, staring down the road like she expected him to return. AAA arrived about 10 minutes later. The tow driver didn't comment on anything except for the cold. The woman gave me a little wave when I left, and we didn't exchange names. When I told my boyfriend and my best friend what happened, they brushed it off. They said that he was probably just being polite, that lots of people offer rides in the winter around here, that I assumed the worst. And maybe they're right. Maybe it was nothing, but that door handle says otherwise, right? I mean, people don't check a locked door unless they've already decided what happens next if it opens. And now, every time that I drive home late at night, I always make sure the gas tank isn't anywhere close to empty. When I finally managed to get a few days off of work, I decided that I was going to spend at least one night on my land, 20 acres of dry ridges and scattered desert brush tucked near the Sierra Diablo foothills. I'd bought it a few years earlier, back when I was still driving long haul, always passing through the wide, quiet stretch of Texas and feeling like some part of me belonged to the emptiness there. I had pictured campfires and long sunsets, a place that felt like mine. The first part of the evening was exactly what I'd imagined too. The sky turned the soft kind of orange that makes the land look ancient. I cooked fajitas over a fire made from dried cactus skeleton, the smoke sweet and faint, and I ate slowly, watching the heat fade from the horizon, just relaxing. Now, if the story ended there too, I would have called it one of the best nights of my life. But right after the sun dipped fully below the ridgeline, that quiet changed. I noticed something down in the wash, just a shape at first, dark and low to the ground. My neighbors let their cattle wander, so I assumed it must have been one of them, but it stayed unusually still for cattle. It didn't graze, it didn't move in fact. It just sort of sat there watching. I told myself not to be ridiculous. I mean, animals do stare. I poured a little more wine and I let the fire burn itself low. Eventually I settled in the back seat of my truck for the night. The cell service out there is so poor that it's basically decorative, but I had just enough of a signal to check the weather before everything went dead again. I covered the windows with blankets, climbed into the makeshift bed, and let the silence take over. Now, I don't know how long I slept before I woke up, but no noise woke me, of that I'm absolutely sure. No dream as well, but just a feeling, I guess, sharp and heavy. My heart was already racing when I opened my eyes, and I tried not to look outside. I really did, but curiosity works like gravity, right? So I lifted the blanket on the window only an inch, and on the slope of the neighboring property, something upright was moving slowly toward my fence line. I couldn't see the details, just the outline, but it looked like a person, except I don't know how to explain it exactly. Something was wrong in the way that they held themselves. Their movement was steady, but way too measured, like they were trying to seem casual, but failing. I lowered the blanket and sat perfectly still. I told myself that it must have been a late ranch hand come to get the cattle or something. In fact, I told myself anything that I could think of that sounded normal. Maybe a hiker, a trick of distance. But the feeling in my chest, it just didn't believe any of it really. And then I started seeing shapes. Not clear ones and not like silhouettes, but more like I kept thinking that there was someone just behind the back window or just past the driver's side mirror. My mind felt loud all of a sudden, if that makes any sense, and it was like every instinct that I had was just yelling at me all at once. And finally, I snapped. I climbed into the driver's seat, ripped down all the blankets so every window was open to the night, and flicked on my headlights. The beams, they hit the wash directly as well. And something moved, but it was so fast that I've never seen anything move that quickly, just outside of the light, like a person stepping backward into the darkness to avoid being seen, but with unreal speed. Well, I didn't wait to understand it. I turned the engine over and drove off the land faster than I should have on those rocky tracks, but I was panicking. The truck rattled hard enough to make the rear view vibrate, and I didn't slow down until I reached the highway. When I finally got into town, I went to the woman who rents rooms to travelers, and she didn't ask me any questions, and I didn't offer any answers. The next day, I called the previous owner to update her, just small talk at first, and I mentioned that the land felt different at night. I didn't even describe what happened. I barely finished the sentence before she cut in quietly. Yeah, a lot of people don't feel safe out there after sundown. I always wondered if it was just the isolation. She said it like she was trying to make it sound harmless, but it wasn't. Like she already knew that it didn't feel harmless, is what I mean. I still own the land, I still love it. I still tell myself that I'll go back and stay again at some point, and I mean really stay, make peace with whatever is out there. But I'll be honest and say that it has been 2 years, and I have not spent another night there since that night. The thought of being watched in that silence out there, it definitely still sits with me in a very uneasy sort of way. Some places are beautiful for sure, and some are beautiful in a way that I guess just doesn't want you there. I don't usually run errands late, but that night I got off work later than planned and figured that I'd make a quick grocery run before heading home. The nearest store is about 20 minutes away, and out where I live, that's considered pretty close. It was already dark when I left town, but the sky was clear and the road was familiar, so I got there pretty quickly. A few miles from home, though, my car's temperature gauge spiked. I pulled over and I popped the hood. I had some coolant issues before, so I knew what I was looking at, and I let the engine cool, drove a little farther, and it happened again, this time just a couple of miles from my road. At that point, it was around midnight, though, and I honestly was pretty exhausted. I wasn't thrilled about leaving my car, too, but I live in an area where walking 1.5 miles on a dirt road in the dark really isn't that unheard of. I told myself that it would be fine. The night air was pretty chilly, and the moon was bright enough that I didn't need a flashlight on my phone. I locked the car, slung my bag over my shoulder, and I started walking. The first stretch along the highway was pretty easy, too. Quiet, no cars, no wind, just some crickets. And once I turned onto the dirt road home, it got even quieter, and halfway down, I heard footsteps. Not behind me, but off to my left, somewhere near the edge of my neighbor's driveway. I figured that it was one of their dogs or maybe a deer or something. People out here are protective of their properties, so I also wondered if someone had noticed me walking late and stepped outside to see who it was and what they were doing. Then I saw someone coming up the driveway. At first, it was just movement, a person-shaped outline moving uphill through patches of moonlight. My stomach dropped, though, because I assumed it was a neighbor who thought that I was snooping or trying to break in or something. I braced myself for a flashlight in the face or a dozen rapid questions, or, perhaps worst case, a gun pointed in my direction. That's just how people are around here anyway. They don't play around at night on rural land. But when the figure came fully into view, I realized that I didn't recognize him. I would say he was a medium-built guy, maybe a few inches taller than me, wearing a flannel and jeans. Longish hair, no flashlight, no jacket, which was odd because it was pretty chilly. He walked with his hands in his pockets, like he had nowhere in particular to be. He stepped out onto the road and fell into pace with me, about 30 feet to my left, separated by a fence. He didn't say anything, though. He didn't look directly at me, and he just walked. Not fast, not slow, but just matching me. I kept walking, trying to act like this was normal, like this happened all the time, but my heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it now. I didn't ask who he was, I didn't say a word in fact. I figured that if he wanted to talk, that he would. If he wanted something else, well, I would have to think about what I would do if that happened. When we reached the end of the fence line near the bend in the road, he stopped. He rested one arm on the top rail and finally looked at me. Not threatening and not angry, but just, I don't know, a look of tiredness, I guess, or maybe sadness, or something that I don't just have a word for, maybe. I gave a small nod, not friendly, but just sort of acknowledging him. Then I kept walking, refusing to look back. I didn't start to feel scared until the house was almost in sight too, I think. That's when the full strangeness of all of that really hit me. I mean, someone walked with me, silently, in the middle of nowhere, popping out of nowhere, in the middle of the night, mind you, and I had no idea who he was or why he did it. In the morning, I told my dad about it over coffee. I expected him to laugh it off or brush it off at the very least. Instead, he asked me to show him exactly where it happened. When I pointed out the driveway with the old split-rail fence, his expression changed suddenly. He reminded me, not in a dramatic way, just a sort of matter-of-fact way, that a guy who lived there years back had taken his own life. He said that the man had a reputation for wandering the road at night when he was struggling, not walking and not talking to anyone, but just trying to be near people without asking for anything. I just sat there for a while after he said that, not scared, but certainly unsettled in a different way that I hadn't experienced before. I don't think that I saw anything supernatural. In fact, I think that I saw a real person, someone who didn't know how to ask for company, perhaps, or someone who maybe used to walk that road the same way that I was, someone who didn't want to be alone, I guess, and I guess I can't rule out a paranormal explanation, but, I mean, I just don't really believe in that stuff. Still, though, I really have no idea who that was or what they were doing there. Where I live, the land stretches out so far that sound from neighbors just isn't really heard. The hills are steep, the woods are thick, and when night falls, it sort of feels like the whole place just folds in on itself. My family has been here for generations now, and I grew up thinking that I knew every bend in the creek bed and every worn trail through those oaks. A few years ago, though, the ridge beyond our pasture was sold and turned into an ATV course. Since then, we've certainly noticed more wildlife pushed closer to our side, deer moving in broad daylight, coyotes yipping where they never used to, and sometimes some other animals as well. It changed the way that the land feels after dark, I guess. Quieter, but not peaceful by any means. Anyway, one night early in November, my younger siblings decided to take the Polaris out. It was late, somewhere close to 10:30, and they planned to make one loop around the property before heading in. The bridge over the creek is always the starting marker. Once you cross it, you're out on the land and not near the house anymore. At first, everything was normal. The engine noise, the music from the speaker, a familiar bounce on the trail, and they told me later that there was a moment, though, so small that they didn't mention it to each other, where something about the night just felt different. Like the land wasn't the same land that they had grown up on. But they kept driving anyway. On the second loop, they slowed when they saw something on the trail ahead. The oldest started to stop, but something in her gut told her to keep going and to come back in daylight. So they rolled past it and continued. Mind you, none of them had discussed the feeling yet. It was just a bit of silent tension, really. A few minutes later, though, as they rounded the open field near the far fence line, the middle one looked out toward the tree line and sort of froze. He didn't describe it to us right away, not for several days anyway, but what he saw, he said, wasn't a creature standing upright or anything dramatic like that. It was just a very large animal, bigger than a deer, but its posture was strange, its weight forward, its head was low like it was evaluating them. Its outline blended into the shadows too, so he could only really make out its mass and the pale glint of eyes, but whatever it was huge. He said that they looked reflectively the way that deers do, only these didn't flicker or shift, they held the whole time. That was when he told the oldest to drive quickly, and there was no shouting and no panic, but just sort of a bit of urgency, really. They turned back toward the creek. The youngest, who hadn't seen the animal herself, started crying the closer they tried to get to the ridge. She couldn't explain why, just that it felt like something was right behind them, matching their speed. When they reached the gate, though, the oldest had to get out to undo the chain, and she said later that the air felt different then, heavy, like the whole tree line was paying attention. She didn't look up, and she just got back in and slammed the latch shut behind them. They drove home in silence, and when they walked into the house, their eyes looked huge. Each of them just had a full-blown adrenaline rush, is how they described it. Mind you, no one had been drinking, and no one was making things up, and they were just scared, I guess. Well, the next morning, we went out in daylight. The field looked normal, the trail looked normal too. There were some fresh hoof prints, large ones, definitely not deer, but nothing conclusive. Probably cattle from another property wandering down again, or maybe an elk, which had been moving into the area lately because of land disruption that I mentioned earlier, and also some hunting pressure up on the ridge. But as for the feeling, the dread, they all described it the same way. It wasn't like being chased, it was not like being watched, more like they were somewhere that they shouldn't have been. And honestly, that's pretty believable to me. Because when you've lived on the land your whole life, you get used to knowing where you are and what's out there. You get used to sensing when something is off. Wild animals act differently at night. Predators move differently when the balance of territory shifts. And sometimes your body notices before your brain does, I guess. We still ride those trails. We still cross the ridge, and nothing has ever happened since then. But none of us really go out there late anymore just to kill time like we used to. Not because of monsters or legends or anything, but just because some nights the land feels like it belongs to something else, and, well, that's certainly enough to keep us away. I hadn't been back to the Northwest Desert in years, not really since high school anyway. But in late August of 2013, I found myself there again. It was the kind of dry night where the sky is so clear that it almost felt fake. My old friend John had invited us out there to his family's land near the San Juan Basin. His parents were overseas for a few weeks, and he wanted to get everyone together before returning to school. The plan was supposed to be small, just a gathering of familiar faces, really. But word moves fast when there's space, booze, and no adults about. By the time that my friends and I arrived, Jacob, Sean, and I, the place didn't look like a simple gathering anymore. Cars lined the dirt driveway and spilled into open pasture, music echoed against the low stone ridge to the south, bonfires flickered, laughter carried on the warm wind, and the river shimmered faintly behind the cottonwoods. John's cousin, Alex, and a guy that we called Tank showed up shortly after us as well. Tank was called Tank because he was huge, the sort of person who made door frames look narrow wherever he went, and everyone automatically felt safer just having him around. It started off how nights like this always do too. Warm light, cheap beer, dust swirling around your boots and sandals, kids dancing near speakers powered off of a generator. For a while it felt good too, loose, like being 17 again and not worrying about the next morning. But Jacob had this way of reading the air, I guess. He wasn't paranoid without reason, he just noticed things that others didn't. And this time, he kept glancing toward the long dirt road that wound up around the highway. "If someone calls the sheriff," he said, "but they'll be here before anyone can react." We brushed him off until we noticed that the guy posted at the gate, that one job that mattered, was asleep in a lawn chair with empty bottles on his chest. Then came the headlights. Not drifting, not wandering, but purposeful. When the red and the blue flickered against the ridgeline, the entire atmosphere shattered. Someone killed the music, and for a second it felt like the whole land took a breath. Then chaos erupted, like a kicked anthill. People ran in every direction, toward their cars, toward the river, into the fields. You could hear yelling, doors slamming, engines grinding, barked orders ricocheting across the open land, dust absolutely everywhere, and voices lost in it. But we didn't think to, we just moved with everybody else. Tank cut through a section of wire fence to get us toward the riverbed. The wire snapped and tore my jeans wide open, unfortunately. I didn't have time to care though. We just plunged into the brush so thick that it formed a sort of natural pocket. The river, it was behind us, and we crouched low, trying to calm our breathing. Someone else stumbled into the same spot, two people who looked just as terrified as we were, and we all just gestured at each other to stay quiet. The officers, they were close too. Their flashlights swept over the brush like searching eyes. The dogs were worse, the way that they were breathing and footsteps cut through everything. And at one point, an officer yelled that anyone underage could just come out and call their parents, like it was mercy, but nobody moved. Then, from the riverbed behind us, we heard something moving through the water. Not walking and not swimming, but more like pushing through it. It was slow and heavy, the way that something big sounds when it's moving through water. I assumed that it must have been somebody else trying to cross, but the breathing didn't match, and it was deep, labored, almost human, but not quite. Tank whispered that something was back there. I told him that it was probably somebody else, but even I didn't believe that. Before anything could happen too, we heard someone shouting from the ridge above us, declaring the area clear now. And somehow, unbelievably, the officers believed it and shifted their search elsewhere. Later we realized that it was another guy that we knew, hiding up high and improvising badly, but amazingly, it actually worked. The second that the lights disappeared though, we didn't wait to see what had been in that water, but we ran for that ridge. The climb was absolutely miserable, rocks scraping our hands, cactus needles sticking into our clothes, dust sticking to sweat. But when we reached the top, we thought that we were safe, but we could still see the property below, lights flashing, people still scattering. And then, something ran across the flat of the mesa ahead of us. It didn't linger, it didn't look at us, it just crossed, fast, like someone sprinting on uneven terrain at full speed without stumbling once. All I caught was the silhouette, shoulders too broad for the height, arms that swung way too low, a gait that wasn't wrong but just strange, really. None of us said anything at first, because saying something would mean acknowledging that we all saw it, I guess. We left the ridge and headed north to avoid law enforcement. But to do that, we had to push through a dense hill of cottonwoods and sagebrush. The night was way too quiet now too, so quiet that the crunch of our shoes sounded deliberate. And that was when we heard laughter. High, light and playful, like children laughing, but there were no kids there. It wasn't coming from one direction either. It was somewhere above and then below and then closer, like it moved without movement. No words, but just laughter. Sean yelled out, trying to break whatever was happening, but no reply came, just a softer laugh like someone responding from behind a wall. We didn't check. We didn't shine lights, we didn't investigate, we just left. We walked for what felt like miles before looping back toward the outskirts of the property. Eventually, we made it to the next town too, where someone had already started another party a few miles away. But the second party never felt right after that. Everybody was laughing, music was playing, people were acting like the night hadn't just cracked open a seam. And then someone told us that Larry, one of John's closest friends, had flipped his truck trying to leave earlier, and unfortunately, he didn't make it. Everything got quiet after that, and it's strange how fast a night can change like that. 1 hour you're laughing under the stars, the next you're realizing just how thin the line is between going home safe and not going home at all. I still don't know what crossed the mesa that night. I don't know who or what laughed in those trees, but sometimes when I pass through that part of the desert, I get chills just thinking back on that night. I'm going to cut to the chase and say that I don't believe in the supernatural. In fact, I've only ever had one unexplainable experience in my life, and I'm still trying to this day find a reasonable explanation for it. This story, it's been stuck in my head since I was a kid, and I start to tear up whenever I think about it. This was in the first house that I remember living in. I'm pretty sure that we were the first people living there as well, and it certainly wasn't old enough for someone to have died in it. I remember as a kid that I would regularly hear voices calling my name. The voices didn't sound like anyone that I know, but I would also see huge opaque shadows that would very quickly move across the hallway occasionally. And if this was all there was to it, I would just assume that this was a hallucination caused by a family history of mental illness or something like that. But I very vividly remember my aunt and cousins visiting our house, and I told one of my cousins, I believe that she was 13 at the time, about the weird shadows and how they would call my name. I showed her the hallway that this would take place in, and eventually, one of the shadows appeared and moved across the hallway while she was there with me. She jumped a little bit and just said, "Whoa," in that kind of tone that you would use when talking to a dog that's jumping on you. I remember hearing the voice and asking my cousin if she heard it too, but she said that she didn't. But nevertheless, she was super creeped out by the shadow. Neither of my parents nor my sibling remember this happening, but I remember it so vividly, and it was such a frequent occurrence that, honestly, I don't think that it could have been just a nightmare or a hallucination. It was 2009-ish. I was living on the road for 2 years at this point, hitchhiking and riding trains. I was a dumb 18 to 19-year-old. I had been all over the country, West Coast multiple times, Southwest, and decided to see the East Coast at this point. Went to Florida and went to a small festival there too. It's called a rainbow gathering. They're kind of like the big meetups of traveler kids, old hippies, tramps, these kinds of people. They're always in state parks or national parks. Rangers will patrol it and police sometimes show up, but for some reason it's allowed. Anyway, I'm not sure how, but these have been going on since the 70s, I think. Some people who show up are pretty hardcore train hopper gutter punk types, and some are super chill Christians who will wash your feet, literally. It's a very unusual festival, I guess. There are smaller regional gatherings and a big national gathering where thousands of people show up. Kind of the poor man's Burning Man, I guess. Huge fire pits get dug out, elaborate latrines, hundreds of drum circles. Free food is constantly made from kitchens, which are just camps devoted to making food for all of us bums. And well, I met some friends at a smaller regional one in Florida, and we parted ways never thinking that I was going to see them again. One was named Anna, and we sort of hit it off a bit. I hitchhiked north all the way upstate to New York. When I caught wind of the national gathering, which was going to be in Pennsylvania, I figured that I might as well go. I got to this gathering early, in the Allegheny National Park, and helped set up, trying to meet people, kind of looking for my group, I guess. Not sure where I was going to be camping. One day, though, I ran into Anna, who I had met in Florida. Me and her had some spiritual conversations in Florida, talking about fairies and UFOs and whatnot, and she had some unusual stuff happen to her when she was a kid. So, she and her buddy had just gotten to Pennsylvania, and we decided the three of us were going to team up. We noticed a ton of people showing up to this thing. It was getting really crowded, so we decided to move camp to a more remote area. We chose a spot off the main trail, which goes from the parking lot to the gathering. It's a couple of miles long, and there's a lot of foot traffic going up and down there, people going in and out of the festival, but we had some space. Now, this happened around dusk. Me and Anna, we were sitting by our little twig fire, stone cold sober. Alcohol isn't really allowed at a gathering like this. It does still get in, but there's a camp at the parking lot called A Camp where all the drinkers stay. There is, of course, other drugs at these festivals, but me and Anna and her friend just weren't into the whole drum circle scene. We had just gotten done having a deep talk about spirituality when we started to feel hungry and stood up to start heading down to the main circle, which is where everyone can get one big meal a day. We're standing up when Anna says, "Hey, do you hear that?" And I said, "No," and just kept putting out the fire with my foot. And she was like, "No, hey, shh, listen." So I stopped and I could hear the sound of someone walking through the forest. The thing that was weird about it, though, was that it was coming from a direction where there was no festival. So the festival was down below us about, I don't know, maybe a half mile if we were looking down the trail. And this sound was coming from our left, where it's just hundreds of miles of Pennsylvania woods. The parking lot is way up the trail, a few miles behind us. And it was odd because it sounded like a person speed walking toward us. I didn't think deer because they wouldn't be coming up to a fire pit. I genuinely thought it was just some lost hippie, I guess. As this sound was getting closer, there were some people walking down the trail and some walking up the trail. There's a sort of weird custom called Nick at Night. If you yell "Nick at Night," a dude with a tin can full of tobacco will find you and roll you a cigarette. There's about 10 of them sort of just walking around, and their sole job is to maintain everyone's nicotine habit. They get a ton of donations from A Camp. So anyways, these two groups run into a Nick at Night kid, and now are all sort of standing together on the main trail talking about 10 meters below us, oblivious to us. So while that's happening to our right and below us, the sound of someone walking from our left has gotten so close now that really we should be seeing who or what it was, and there just wasn't anything there. I was sort of frozen, I guess, kind of stuck in a state of confusion, and I think Anna was too. No fear, just why aren't we seeing this person? We could visibly see leaves and dirt being kicked up too, like there was an invisible person power walking by. Whatever it was, it went right up to that group of people in the main trail and didn't stop, but it slowed down like it was checking them out. They seemed to be totally oblivious to this. They were all smoking, talking and laughing, I guess. But it kind of did a turn as it went up to them and then suddenly did a straight line towards me and Anna. Anna had a keychain with a million things on it, and she was frantically looking for this mini flashlight that she had on it. It was dusk, so not bright out, but still light enough that we could see the footfalls and the debris being kicked up. My mind was thinking that there must be a squirrel or a field mouse hopping on the forest floor or something. The forest floor was covered in dead leaves, but these steps were quick, as if this was a child or a small person walking fast. It's hard to explain this, and I hope you get the drift, but this thing, it came right up to us. I am standing to the right of our smouldering fire, and Anna to the left. I could hear her just struggling with this keychain. It came right up to me, probably 5 or 6 feet away. There was nothing there though, but it did the same thing with the group. It slowed its pace like it was checking us out, like a slow trot. And as it went by, Anna said, "Hey," and shone the light where it was. There was nothing to see, and whatever this thing was, it instantly took off up the hill. Just absolutely took off. It was incredibly fast. The footfalls became like a machine gun. If I had wanted to run after it, there's no way I could have. But a second later, me and Anna took off running the opposite direction, past that group, and just kept going until we were at the bottom. A funny thing happened too. There's people at these gatherings who spend the whole month naked. They'll roll around in the mud and just look like mud people for the whole festival. One of these people we had seen around was a 7-foot giant of a man, probably 400 pounds, naked, covered in mud and leaves. Me and Anna are in full flight mode, and at this point, it's dark and we run right into this guy. It absolutely terrified us initially. Anna screamed and then we all started laughing, and I guess that sort of cancelled out the panic. We went to go and find our other friend, and it was weird because Anna was still pretty scared and she kept saying that it was because of her. Like, she had a weird fairy or alien situation happen to her as a kid with her mum, and she felt like whatever this was because of her. I don't know about any of that, but she did not want to talk about it after, and I just could never get her to elaborate any further. Me and this other friend, we were all about it, and we went back up there. Anna said that she wasn't going and wanted us to pack up the tent. And we'd sort of hung out, tried to look for tracks with our lights, listened, but nothing else ever happened. Honestly, I've gone from thinking that it was an alien like a grey to maybe a ghost or maybe a fairy or a gnome. One person said that it could have been a pukwudgie. These are like Native American gnome things that are tricksters and can turn invisible apparently. They're supposed to be in that area allegedly, but again, I don't know much about any of this stuff. All I know is that there was something invisible walking there that day, and I saw it with my own eyes and heard it with my own ears. I'll start this off by saying that I grew up completely, 100% adamant that the paranormal isn't real. It can all be rationalized, and that people who believe in it haven't thought about it hard enough. I've shared other stories about paranormal events that have happened in my life recently that have completely changed my mind, primarily about my neighbor's house. That's not what I'll be talking about today, though. I live in the Midwest. I live in a small rural lot between a cornfield and a small forest in a camper. I've lived in this county my entire life. I know the entire county like the back of my hand, I guess you could say. This being said, I've come to the conclusion that my experiences around the rural and wooded parts of this county, that there are crawlers. I'm 100% sure of it, in fact. I've had many encounters, actually. Never back to back, but they happen frequently. There's a forest or a park in the middle of town that I always hated at night since I was little. As I got older, my cousin and I thought getting scared was really fun. We would go there at night on purpose, but we never lasted long. I always felt like I was being watched. This, on top of urban legends of people going missing here at night, made me feel really uneasy. Fast forward to a few years ago, though. I got married and am settling into life as a husband. I take my large all-black German Shepherd, Fenrir, on walks with me at night. I always walk towards the park, but I usually don't enter into it. The first time something weird happened was 5 years ago. I was walking Fenrir in the woods to the front and to the right of me. To the left and behind me was a neighborhood edge and a sort of small playground, when suddenly it just went silent. My dog started acting super anxious. He's usually a very stoic and quiet dog, though. He's 120 pounds and built like a tank. Looks very intimidating, and he knows it too. I heard rustling in the woods following me, though, and I felt like I was being stalked by something. At that, I ran home, and really that was the end of the first encounter. Nothing much to it. I had a few more encounters like that, but last year, things really amped up. I was on a walk around 11:30 p.m. with Fenrir, my wife, and our little newer dog Booger. He's a terrier chi mix, and we are walking down the same path, and about 3 blocks away from the woods, 4 or so deer are sprinting out of the trees and into the street towards us, and for whatever reason they seem terrified. But then I hear what I can only describe as what sounded like a human trying to mimic the sounds of a monkey. Honestly, too, I thought that it was silly until, well, recently when I read a story about another guy who heard the same thing. We laughed it off as some kids playing around. Once we get up to the woods and are walking parallel with it, we can clearly see 2 reflective eyes and a silhouette staring us down from the tree line. We also heard a deep growl at this point, and then like a hissing sound, but it wasn't super high-pitched or anything. Both of our dogs acknowledged this as well. Finn stared and Booger growled a bit. I made a Facebook post on the community Facebook group, and other people told me similar stories from around this town. It was around this point too that I got a job as a tour guide or a maintenance guy for Rail Explorers. I'm working there again this year as well, and we start April 1st. Basically though, they take unused or tour-specific railroad sections that aren't used federally, and they have these sort of pedal carts with motor assist on them that you can use to explore the tracks. It's really cool and really fun, and the one that I work at is like 5 minutes from where I live, and it goes through the woods in an inaccessible part of the county, unless you float down the river and hike up steep loose dirt hills, that is. You go under one old car bridge, and then you go over 2 multi-100-foot length old train bridges. The first one is larger and taller, and it's about 150 feet off the ground above the forest. But the second one, that one goes over the river. Now, about 6 months into the job, and it's fall at this point, we work until midnight sometimes, with the last tour leaving at around 9 p.m. And that means that the last tour for the last 2 months of the year, they are made in complete darkness. The way that the job operates is with 6 employees. 4 get on the lead bike, and 2 get on the rear bike. From the lead bike, we drop off 1 person at the busy intersection so they can flag traffic, and 1 person gets dropped off at the large train bridge that goes over the woods. The person at the bridge gives a short safety speech to the customers, who stop and go one at a time over the bridge. The employee carts, they're much faster than the customer ones. We all have walkie-talkies, and we usually have these battery-powered floodlights on stands that we use so the customers can see us. We also have light-up safety vests as well. Now, one particular night, we were behind by 20 or so minutes, I think. Instead of leaving the depot at sunset, we were leaving at dusk at this point. I was stationed at the high bridge, and by the time that we reached the bridge, it was pitch black, aside from the stars providing a little bit of light. My co-workers, they dropped me off and waited with me until the first customer arrived. I gave the little speech to that first cart of 4, I chatted with them a little bit. I was basically trying to buy some time and wait for the next customer cart, so there wasn't a massive gap for my co-workers who have to flip the bikes around. And after a few minutes, I let these customers leave and I was alone. I must have been alone for 20 minutes, I would say. I used the radio so many times, but it was pretty much static for everybody for whatever reason that night. One of the only times we've ever had any issues like that as well. But I kept seeing, like, movement in the tree line. I kept hearing fast footsteps all around me in every direction. I had the floodlight on above my head, so everyone and everything could see me, but I couldn't see anything outside of it. I turned the floodlight off and used my personal flashlight, and I could have sworn that I kept seeing like quick glimpses of pale skin moving quickly. But right when I started seeing stuff, I could hear the next customer car coming close, so I turned the light back on and I waited for them to come around the corner. When they pulled up, I noticed that they had a little boy with them, and he's scared of the dark apparently. I'm terrified at this point, mind you, but have to act appropriately, even more so because of this boy. I really don't want to scare him. As I'm finishing my speech though, I hear movement right behind me. I spin around with my flashlight on instinct, poor kid, I must have frightened him too. I told them that it was probably just a deer and that they are good to go across the bridge. That same night, the person stationed at the intersection, this isn't like an in-town intersection, it's very rural. It's right next to a massive cornfield. He's Native American and was very in tune with this culture. And he told me privately a few weeks later that he heard rustling in the cornfield, and whatever was out there was apparently whispering his name and trying to get him to come into the field. He was also without communication for about those 20 minutes, but he wasn't in the woods and he could see a lot better than me. Another time, me and that same co-worker were headed back to the front cart. We were a ways ahead, so we stopped the cart in the middle of the high bridge. It sounds scary. I am a bit afraid of heights, and this bridge has massive gaps between the planks that you could definitely slip through, but after doing it so often, I guess you just get used to it. In any case, it was a clear night that night, and we were watching the stars and just small talking. But then, it goes really silent. We're about 100 or so feet in the air above the woods, mind you. We can hear for miles as well. The dogs barking across the river 2 miles can be heard without even seeing the houses. But then, we hear what sounds like a human, mimicking a monkey noise again, and we hear growling. He looks at me completely seriously and tells me in a stern tone that we need to get out of here right now. I drive the heck out of there, no questions asked, and he moved states to Nevada shortly after this as well. A few other things happened here and there and to co-workers as well. Each of my co-workers have at least one story to tell. I'm only sharing mine at this point because otherwise this would be way too long. But a few months go by and it's late fall, around the middle of November. I drive through that park in town a lot when I just want to go for a drive, and I had my dog again, Fenrir, with me, and it's around 2 in the morning. I can't sleep, so I'm listening to Melvin's CD and driving leisurely through the park. As soon as I get past the entrance gates, though, I feel really uneasy and just sort of weird all of a sudden. Mind you, I'm not easily scared by much, but going to that park at night, it makes me feel a primal fear. It's beyond fight or flight. I've never felt that way in my life anywhere else, in fact, ever, and I feel it every time that I'm there. So I'm driving through the park and I've rolled the windows up a lot more. Fenrir can still poke his head out but can't leap out. As I go deeper into the woods, I feel just worse and worse. I decide not to turn around because I'm already past the halfway point anyway. Turning around at this point would actually make me stay in the woods longer. I started speeding where there weren't turns that I couldn't see around. I round the last corner and what I saw, it will forever stay with me. There was a pale, skinny humanoid, tall and lanky and not quite human, crawling on its hands and feet, but it was crawling so quickly that it must have been going 20 miles per hour at least. We don't have bears here. The only animal that size are large humans and deer, and I can assure you that that was no deer. It went from my right, across the street, and then just went into the tree line. Fenrir saw it too, and he doesn't bark at animals, not even other dogs, but at this thing, whatever it was, he went absolutely ballistic. He was going crazy. In fact, he was trying to force himself out of the small gap in the window, nearly foaming at the mouth and snarling. He never acts like that, ever. I'm a certified dog trainer, and I've raised him from birth, and I've never seen him like this before. In any case, I quickly got out of there, and we didn't look back. Most recently, I've sort of become, I don't know, maybe obsessed with this park, I guess is the way to say it. I've walked there at night from my camper to the park with Fenrir, and I'll never do it again. I didn't see a figure this time, but as I was entering the park, a massive owl flew by my head, so close that I could have smacked it mid-flight. This made me feel a bit weird for some reason. And as soon as I get into the park, I feel extremely weird again, anxious and nauseous. I walk a few hundred yards to the only streetlight in the entire park, and I turn around and face the woods. Me and Fenrir stand there frozen for like 10 minutes, because the silence was, again, absolutely deafening. Anytime I heard anything, I was jumpy. Finn was anxious as heck too. He kept staring into a certain spot in the woods a ways off as well. And I swear that I saw eyes in there every once in a while too. I built up the courage to walk out, and after that, I haven't gone back since. It will be interesting to see what happens at my job this year. I wanted to add that the county that I live in is packed full of abandoned mines as well, hundreds of them, and I'm not 100% sure if it's all related or not, but based on some of the things that I'm reading, apparently there might be some sort of a connection. For a little bit of background, I'm a 24-year-old female who loves scary stories, horror movies, true crime, etc. It takes a fair bit to scare me, though I haven't actually experienced many terrifying or life-threatening events, fortunately. This was during the middle of August in northern Texas, summer of 2023. The nighttime temperatures were around 100 degrees at this point. So my dad and one of my brothers, who's 11, drove an hour north into the countryside to go stargazing for my brother's Scout Merit badge. But there are some twisty gravel roads in the forest as you approach Black Creek Lake, and we got to see a coyote, a deer, and even some raccoons. We live in the city, so we don't often see such animals, and we honestly thought that would be our excitement for the night. We then finally made it to the recreational park grounds beside the lake. The layout is pretty simple there. If you're standing in the round parking lot, then the campgrounds are to the north and west, the lake is south, and the path in and out is east of us. But there are no official campgrounds east of this recreational area, which is important for later. So, we got there at around 10 p.m. and we set up. We were able to successfully see some stars through my telescope as well as Saturn, which was exciting for us. Throughout this whole time, though, there are two parties, or what might have been one group in a parking lot and surrounding nearby area. One party was kayaking and then later fishing from the boat ramp area west of us. To the north, in the lot, there were two cars as well. And from that direction, we were constantly hearing a loud and sort of irritating voice of a woman who was obviously in a bad mood and didn't want to be there. She continuously cursed at someone, or no one in particular, and at one point was mad at someone for taking her keys and obstructing her from driving, which obviously made it sound like she was drunk or under some other influence. At one point in the night, around 11 p.m., we hear someone loudly, sporadically honk one of the car horns over and over in sort of random patterns. Then we hear the obnoxious woman rudely tell someone to wake up over and over again, then proceeding to hold down the horn for a few seconds at a time, and continuing her assault on the horn and our ears. By this point, my family and I are just about ready to leave due to this loud commotion. I personally was fixing to go over there myself and tell her off, but I knew that probably wasn't the best idea. I definitely didn't want to put myself and my unborn baby in any danger. Then, for maybe about 20 or 30 minutes, we were able to watch the stars in relative peace with little noise coming from the other two parties. Fortunately, none of these people were directly involved with what happened next, but it may have been the cause of it. So just before midnight, we packed up our stargazing stuff and we got in the car. Now, the gravel path to the exit is up a sort of slight hill or slope, meaning from the parking lot, you really can't see past where the path goes up and around a couple of trees. We drive up the hill, and just as the headlights come back down to illuminate the path in front of us, and the trees to our right side, it was right then and there that we see a man wearing only black shorts and no shirt. The timing was honestly straight out of a horror movie, to just suddenly see someone out of nowhere like that. He must have been in his late 20s or maybe early 30s and had short dark hair. Just as the light hit him though, he was standing and walking right there, just to the right of our car in front of us at a very close distance, only a couple of feet away I would guess. But the guy, he had been walking towards our direction, and upon seeing us, quickly raised both of his arms to flip us off with both hands. He keeps his hands and arms raised and is quickly and loudly saying something to us with anger or something in his voice. We couldn't understand what he was saying though, since we had the radio on and all of this happened so quickly. The second the man saw us though, he started walking toward our car quickly. My dad was driving slowly initially to avoid the agitated man, thinking that he might need help. My dad, in a sort of confused voice, says, "What is he doing?" But I just reply with, "No, go, go, go," and we sped off. I knew that this was not a situation where we needed to stick around and ask questions. It freaked me out a little bit imagining what would have happened too, if the guy had reached the car a few seconds later, if we hadn't have sped off like that. I'm not very familiar with my dad's car, and it scares me that I might have ended up pressing the wrong button to lock the door or whatever, and the guy could have opened it and done who knows what. We left and we never had anything else happen, but we did wonder who that guy was and also where he came from. The direction that he was walking from had no official campgrounds, only the forest. Maybe he lived in one of the scattered houses in the woods that we'd passed by on our long journey there. I wondered why he had been walking in our direction, toward the recreational area. My best theory is that he wanted to confront the group that had been honking the horn and waking up the entire forest, but upon seeing our car leave, maybe he thought that it had been us making the racket. Even if that's not it, or the man needed help, which is not likely considering his reaction to us, I couldn't help but feel an immediate sense of danger upon seeing him. I really hope that no harm came to those two other parties that night, but honestly, he was sort of heading in that direction, and it wouldn't surprise me if there was some sort of a confrontation, or who knows, maybe worse. This is a story that pops back up into my mind from time to time. I've only ever told it to a few people, but I definitely feel like it deserves its place here. It's for sure one of the scariest moments that I've ever had as a kid, and something that I just cannot forget. So back when I was around 10 years old, my mum finally decided that it was time for her to start taking a driver's license. When she began taking lessons, she was struggling a lot, and for that reason, my dad decided that he wanted to do some practice with her besides the official driving lessons with her instructor, just to make sure that she would pass the upcoming test first try. My little brother and I, we were attending swimming lessons at this nearby university at the time. Behind a forested area near the university, there's this huge student parking area, surrounded by trees, which turned out to be basically empty every weekend. My dad, he saw the opportunity to take my mum here to drive around for a bit, and brought my little brother and I with them since we were too young to stay home alone. We also brought a football with us. Now, when we arrived to the parking lot later on in the evening, my parents began their practice. My little brother and I, we quickly got pretty bored though and asked if we could go over to this little grass field on the side of the parking lot just to play some football. My parents, they let us since they'd always be able to keep their eyes on us whilst driving around. After playing for some time, my parents ended up driving around in the other end of the parking lot. They weren't far, mind you, maybe 300 to 400 meters away from my brother and I, max. But suddenly, this white Toyota pulls up into the parking lot. We were playing almost right at the exit or entrance, I guess you could say. The car turns around and it stops on my right side with the vehicle facing the exit. The driver rolls down his windows and presents himself as Thomas. He looked friendly, I guess, was good looking and young. I guess would be around 30. But this is where things started to get a bit weird. You see, in the passenger seat was a woman covering her face with a newspaper. All I could see was long blonde hair, and on the back seat was a baby sat in a baby chair. Thomas immediately states that he's from the police and that we apparently have to get into the car immediately as he has to talk with us. My brother actually took 2 steps towards the vehicle, but I stuck my arm in front of his chest as I was sensing something was off. The woman was still covering her face at this point, not saying a word. Thomas then raised his voice and told us once again to get into the car or else he'd have to come out and get us. My brother and we just sort of froze out of fear. Suddenly though, the woman put down the newspaper, showed her face and told us in the most calm motherly voice to just listen to the man. The woman looked young, pretty, and like a person who honestly wouldn't hurt a fly. At this moment, I began screaming as loud as I could. What we hadn't seen at that point was that my dad was already running as fast as he could toward us. He was coming from behind the vehicle, so we didn't see it. My parents didn't have time to drive to us since the road down the parking lot, it was sort of twisted all the way. When my dad heard my scream, he started yelling as loud as he could, "Hey, who the heck are you? Get away from my children." As soon as Thomas heard my dad and realized my brother and I weren't alone, he threw that car into gear and took off as fast as he could. He most definitely looked like a person who just soiled himself when he saw my dad. My dad was absolutely furious though, and told my brother and I to hurry up back to the car. He didn't even think about calling the police at that point. He wanted to beat up the guy himself. That resulted in us driving around for the next hour trying to find him before my dad cooled down and decided that he should probably just call the police. We never did find out who those people were, but this episode, I guess you could call it, taught me to never judge a book by its cover. People can be the most friendly looking people in the world and still wish evil upon you or the ones you love. I'm really not sure what these people would have done to us, but I'm sure about one thing. They definitely were not the police. So, before I start this post, I'll say that I was very young, but my mother recalls the experience quite clearly herself. I'm not really into cryptozoology at all, but I am curious if this is a common sighting, or what exactly my mother, father, and I experienced. This was along Route 66 going from Texas into New Mexico. We were heading to my great-grandfather's funeral back in 2005, in the middle of the summer, and I was 10 at the time. The sun was starting to set, and I remember us talking. I'm eating a Happy Meal that they bought me at the time, and we were just swapping stories and having a good time. They made me this little cubby-like area in the trunk for me to lay down in, color, etc. But most of the trip was spent just looking out the window, watching things pass by. While my parents were talking and the radio was on, I was just watching the world pass by, but I remember very clearly seeing a man standing and staring at cars. He wore a black trench coat, bowler or perhaps top hat, a black beard, but the part that I remember the most vividly was bright glowing red eyes. I pointed it out to my mum, who was distracted at the time, having not seen it. And well, a couple of hours go by and I'm still looking out my window. I made a little game for myself to see if I could count how many birds I could spot along the way, and the sun was starting to set as well. And the next thing I know, I see the same dude just ahead of us. But now, because of the dark, the eyes were a lot more intense. My mum got a little bit concerned about it and told my dad to speed up. Eventually, fatigue set in and we found a rest stop. It was pitch black there, like the kind of dark that you can't even see your own feet in without a light, and we were all just trying to sleep at this point. I had to go to the bathroom and my dad walked out with me as I was rather freaked out by the sighting earlier, worried that the guy would come and grab me. As we got out of the car, I remember my father staring off into the distance and told me to hurry up, though keeping his usual calm demeanor. When I finished and got back into the car, he started it for some reason and we took off again, driving to stay in a motel instead. I asked him and my mother about it recently as we were just reminiscing together about trips that we'd taken. And when I asked my dad why he had us go to a motel, he claimed that it was because he saw the same pair of eyes staring at us from a hill near where we were, above a sort of rocky outcrop. I never saw those, so I can't confirm either way, but my dad is certainly not one to make up stories like this. So, does anyone have any idea or stories as to what exactly this could have been? I remember the eyes so vividly, it's burned into my mind, as well as him being out in the desert heat with a heavy trench coat, and, well, I'm not sure. My dad swears that it was the devil. My mum thinks that it was a chupacabra of some sorts. I myself am not really sure what it was. Any thoughts would be appreciated. As I said, this was over 19 years ago and I haven't seen anything since then, as I live far away from Route 66 now, and to be honest, I have no plans of going back there. For the longest time, I have really doubted sharing this, but I just need to know if anyone can help me figure out what any of this means. So when I was 11, we moved into a new house. It was our first day there, and I was busy scrapping off the old wallpaper in my soon-to-be bedroom. My parents, they went to go to the grocery store, but I stayed alone in the house so that I could finish scrapping everything off. After a while, I took a break and was looking out of the window at some point. My back was turned to the door, so I couldn't see it. Then I heard the sound of a door falling shut, and so I turned around to look. And what I saw next was someone standing in my room. Someone who looked exactly like me, but almost as if it was an older version of me, in a long white dress. There was a bright light all around her, almost like an aura. The best that I could describe it is angelic. And then she said, "Do not be afraid." But of course I panicked, and I honestly contemplated just jumping out of the window because I was so scared and had no idea who she was. So while I was turned, my back to her, and was looking out of the window again, I then heard the same sound of the door closing again. I turned around and she was gone. Not too long after that, the doorbell rang and there were my aunt and uncle and cousin who were coming to view the house. I told my cousin what had happened, and for the longest time I honestly thought that I had dreamt it, until years later when my cousin brought it up. So I know for a fact that I didn't make it up because I must have told him about it right after it happened. Is there anyone who knows what this could have possibly meant, or what it could have been? I've had a weird one that's been stuck with me for a while, and I really don't know how to make sense of it. And I have honestly accepted that maybe I'm just not going to be able to figure this one out. So, it was a normal day at home on my day off. I had just bought my house like 3 months ago, I would say, and was still getting used to it. I sat down on my sectional in the living room watching some TV. I had just made some clam chowder, literally my favorite, and set it in front of me while I put on South Park, since it's my comfort show and this was probably around noon. It was still bright out and the house was lit up through the blinds. But this is where I get goosebumps, because I cannot for the life of me remember what happened next. It was just 7:42 p.m. It was like a snap of someone's fingers and the world moved on without me. South Park was still on, definitely not near the episode I started on, which was the episode about Yelpers, and my food was still untouched where I left it. I just wasn't sitting up anymore. I was lying on the couch in front of my fireplace. But I never lay there. I usually use it to sit and tie my shoes before I head out. I can't really explain the feeling, but I'd say that there was an immense raw sense of fear that came over me because I couldn't figure out where the time went or what had happened. There were just no pieces to put together. Besides that too, I just felt kind of sick and out of body, which I kind of attributed to how worked up I got. It never happened to me before, hasn't happened to me since then. No history of anything like that in the family, and so I truly am at a loss for that one. To make myself feel better, I reheated the clam chowder and I ate it though. But some answers to things that have been asked of me before. Yes, I installed a carbon monoxide detector shortly after I bought the house, and it wasn't that. When I woke up, besides the general feeling I had, there were some marks on my foot, like it was tied up in a wire thread, but the marks didn't last until the next day, and then they were gone. There's no history of any epilepsy or blackouts in the family or personally. After this, though, I experienced shivers in my spine is the best way to say it. Not painful, but at random times it just felt like the center of my spine would get cold, and it would shoot up and down the length of my back and give my whole body goosebumps. This still happens to me now and then, but nowhere near as often as when this happened. I also had some missed calls and texts, but I didn't text or call anyone while I was, well, whatever happened. Missing, I guess. That couch is super uncomfortable too. I hate it, and it's just really there to put things on. I have an awesome sectional that I can't get enough of, so I have no idea why I'd randomly wake up on the couch like that. I would never do it to begin with. I wouldn't even let a puppy sleep on it. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I have no idea what happened, and it really freaks me out. This is a story that was actually given to me by a friend. He explained that he woke up in the middle of the night because he thought that he heard footsteps coming down the hallway, and he's alone in the basement. The barn door to his room is locked from the inside with one of those cheap swinging metal latches, and he hears that latch fling open, and the barn door slammed across the slider and dented the wall. Then he describes this short, skinny human with huge eyes, and said that it looked somewhat similar to Gollum from Lord of the Rings. Weak, short, huge eyes, pale, bruised skin. This thing walks around the corner into his room, and as soon as it passes the drywall that was blocking his view, he said that it made eye contact with him for a second, and the thing lunged at him. While he was on his bed and in his underwear, he describes kicking this thing away, and at first the thing would just keep coming back until eventually he kicked it so far that it was out of view, blocked by the wall from his point of view, and the thing just disappears. But he then says immediately after that, this 8-foot-tall, skinny, all-black humanoid thing crawls out of the ceiling, saying that it began walking in circles on all fours above his bed, until after less than a minute of doing so, crawls down the wall that is past the end of his bed, and then stands up at the end of his bed. He said that when it stood, it was as tall as the ceiling was, standing at the small space between the end of his bed and the wall. It sort of crawled down, and it went down the wall-mounted TV behind it. The creature then lunged at him again. He described a similar thing with kicking it off and fighting with it until he kicked it onto a wall, and apparently it disappeared. Now, I'm pretty sure I was sleeping when he called me just after this, obviously terrified and confused, telling me all about what had just happened and how he wasn't sure whether it was a dream or not. Yet, weirdly, the door was open, and he said that he called me right after they were there and didn't remember waking up before he called me. That's really strange, right? In any case, now we know it was 100% not a dream to some extent at least because, well, 1, the barn door is 100 pounds on a track and cannot move on its own weight. 2, the latch was on the inside with horizontal pressure. It needs vertical pressure to open. 3, the wall was definitely dented afterwards, and it was quite a dent, let me tell you. 4, he doesn't remember waking up other than when he heard the footsteps in the hallway. And 5, Events like this began to happen frequently after this until, after months, his mum experienced clearly hearing people in the house when she was home alone. Is that just coincidental? We're not sure, but we think that it adds to the weight of the validity of his own experience. As surprising as it may be, this is one of those stories that I forgot about until, well, a few days ago, when I was talking to a school friend on call and I was reminded of this. She was pretty freaked out when I told her, and so she recommended that I share it here, so here I am. So this happened when I was roughly maybe 7 or 8, so some of the details are a little bit fuzzy, but I do remember the main parts pretty vividly. This may seem like unimportant context as well, but my family had just moved to America and were renting the top portion of your regular suburban house in a pretty safe cul-de-sac. I had some friends, they were triplets, about 3 or 4 houses down from us. It really wasn't that far at all, and every day I would hang out with them. Around 9 or 10 in the night, my older brother, around 11 or 12 at the time, would make the 2-minute walk and come and get me, and walk me home since I was pretty young. And one night, he came to get me as usual. The sun wasn't fully down, but it was getting pretty dark. We started down the walk as normal when he started casting glances over his shoulder. I didn't really notice as well until he shoved me hard away from the sidewalk and in between 2 houses. Each house had a huge fence that separated their backyard, not ours though, and he made me crouch behind the fence. I remember suddenly being really scared, but also confused since I had no idea what the heck was going on. More specifically, he was a pretty big prankster. Once he even convinced me that my older sister had actually crashed her car into the ocean. So I didn't really believe him when he turned and said, "Walk behind the houses, I think somebody might be following us." Looking back now, he was probably trying to keep me calm, but whatever calm was left in my tiny 8-year-old body was gone the moment that I turned around and looked. The man had followed us behind the houses, and he was just by the edge of a few houses down near a different fence line. He had a black hoodie on, with the hood up, black sweatpants and white sneakers. I have pretty bad eyesight now due to some health problems, but back then it was absolutely crystal clear, and I could see, with horrifying clarity, that his jaw was sort of hung open. Like, he was just sort of standing there with his jaw hung open. It was horrifying, and I think now that I'm older, maybe he had some kind of medical condition that affected his jaw, or maybe he did crack or something. I don't know, but back then I could have sworn on God that I was seeing some kind of a demon. Anyway, my brother, when he saw me looking and getting really freaked out, told me to just run as fast as I can to our house. And so we absolutely booked it. Neither of us looked back, but we were scared out of our minds, and like I said, we only rented the top portion of the house, so the bottom, with the sliding door in the backyard, belonged to some other tenant at the time. I don't remember if she was home or not, but I remember tugging that thing open and locking it as fast as I could. And when I looked up, he was there in our yard, a little ways away from the door, staring at us. Me and my brother told my sister and my mother immediately. My father was away on a work trip at the time. But in the end, nothing really came of it. Well, not until the day after, at least. You see, we went to go and meet my dad at his warehouse, which had a small live-in portion above it, where he lazed around until he was ready to head home with us. Around dusk, he came up and told us that we might have to wait since the police were there for some reason. He walked us around to the back window of the small area to show the police all around the backyard area of the warehouses, and there were a few in line, to a white van parked on the grass by the edge of the woods. Like I said, I was pretty young, so I don't remember many details of what actually happened, but I do remember my dad, who hadn't been told about the day prior, telling us that they found a man and a woman in the van. The man, he said, had his mouth hung wide open. He seemed really disturbed telling me about the whole thing and wouldn't answer any more questions about the woman. Maybe she was dead, I've got zero idea, but I do know that they were arrested on trespassing charges apparently. I don't really know anything else about it, and I haven't asked about it either, and I doubt that he would actually remember it. It's been over a decade and he's pushing 70 now. But the whole situation just really freaks me out to this day. I still cannot believe it happened, and I don't have any answers for it. I talked to my brother briefly about it in the hopes that he remembered more than I do, but all I got was a long tirade about whatever medical condition the guy probably had for his mouth to be like that. He's one of those annoying medical students now. But sometimes I think maybe he didn't mean any harm and was just drugged out of his mind or something. But this was, like, in the world's safest neighborhood, and also doesn't explain why or how he showed up at my dad's workplace as well. Plus, if he didn't have any nefarious intentions, why did he follow a couple of kids home so late at night? So, some background first. At the time of this event, I was 20 and a firefighter for the US Army. Everybody is always shook when I say that, but army bases are basically walled-in cities, and like any other city, they require firefighters. Anyway, my best friend was in my unit with me, and for the sake of this retelling, we'll call him Jay. Jay and I were on a 48-hour on and 72-hour off schedule, and being two young idiots with more free time than safe, we developed some pretty dumb hobbies. The biggest of which was actually urban exploration. Now, this had nothing to do with the supernatural, as neither of us had any belief in anything supernatural whatsoever, and simply enjoyed the exploration. It sort of felt like being an archaeologist, except one of recent history, I guess. The place that we were stationed in the US was full of abandoned buildings too, or even entire towns within a few hours' drive. For well over a year, we broke into and explored literally hundreds of abandoned structures, with absolutely no supernatural happenings, and it grew to be all that we could really think about. We spent all of our free time exploring or trawling the forums looking for new places to see. And it was on one of these forums that I came across a post about a town, and I mean a tiny town, that apparently had an abandoned colonial-style mansion. I showed Jay this post, and we decided this mansion would be our next exploration. So we drove the 2 hours from our duty station to this little town, and found a town that consisted of 3 streets, 1 gas station, 1 county tornado shelter, and well, that's about it. I'm talking super tiny town in the middle of the woods in the southeast United States. Well, we went into the gas station and asked the clerk about the mansion, but she claimed to never have heard of it. I should point out at this point as well that the entire town just gave off a really bad vibe. As a former skeptic, I realize how dumb that really sounds, but I just really felt, I don't know, threatened, or maybe oppressed is the better way to say it. Something like that by the entire place, for no real reason. The couple people that we spoke to, they were nice enough, and the place, while perhaps a bit southern poor Methville-ish, was far from the worst area that we had entered in search of an abandoned place to explore. The only thing that I noticed odd about the town, though, was, for as small as it was, there were like 5 churches in the town. Not super abnormal for the Bible Belt, I guess, but none of the churches bore classic Christian iconography, like crosses or such. They also had slightly odd names like Church of the Light and other sort of slightly obscure non-denominational names. Again, not that weird, but a little bit strange. Anyway, the first of the weirdness started after we checked into the hotel that we had booked about 15 miles away in the nearest decent-sized city and came back after dark. Any veteran urban explorer knows to go in after dark and not use bright lights until you're inside the building, unless you want the locals calling the cops on you. So, Jay and I drove all around the town for maybe over an hour, which is pretty impressive considering it was woods, a few fields, and 3 streets looking for the mansion. But we just never found it. We finally parked into the only large parking lot there, the tornado shelter. While we had a smoke and bemoaned the fact that we had wasted time on a false lead, we noticed a group of 5 people walking down the side of the road in our direction. Again, not too odd, but it got really strange when these 5 entered the circle of light created by one of the only 5 streetlights in that town, all in the parking lot of this county tornado shelter, and didn't become any clearer to see. I realize that doesn't sound that scary, but picture this. It's around midnight, give or take about half an hour, and someone is walking up to a lit area. While they approach, they are sort of hard to make out because you're looking at them from an illuminated area into a dark area. They would be hard to see, right? Night vision being what it is and disrupted by the light that you're standing in as well. Nothing odd about that. But when these 5 walked into the light that I was parked under, all 5 did not become illuminated. Again, I know that doesn't really sound all that scary in the telling, but seeing 5 human-shaped dark patches standing directly under a streetlight where anyone, even someone with a dark complexion and black clothing, would have at least had some detail, was weird and terrifying to see. I don't mean that this was a dark person in dark clothing standing in the light. What I mean is this was somehow 5 person-shaped patches of pure black, standing in a well-lit area not even 10 to 15 feet from us. The light had literally no effect on them. Well, at that point, Jay and I said to heck with this, and we just hauled butt out of that town. Now, that was odd and would have been scary enough, but the second and final supernatural effect of my visit were the dreams. I would like to again remind you guys that I never saw the mansion with my own eyes. Jay and I, however, spent nearly a year having the same nightmares about a mansion that, again, I shouldn't be able to really say was there. The dream starts with me walking down a path in the forest for a few seconds before I enter into a clearing and see an old but well-kept 3-story white wood Victorian-style house with a white wood wraparound deck and large wood columns. I walk up the dirt path to 3 wood steps up onto a porch, and then up to the green painted double doors. I suddenly feel sick to my stomach in this place, and feel like something wants me to come inside really badly. But at the same time, I'm 100% certain that I should not enter into this house. Eventually, I open the right double door, and all I can see inside of the house is pitch black. Then I wake up. Now, I know that dream is weird, and look, I get it, it's just a dream. But when you really live through something like this, and it's not a fictional story, it's a really sort of eerie thing to go through. I had that exact same nightmare, and felt the exact same pull to a place that I very much should not enter for almost exactly a year after I went into that god-forsaken town. It was scary enough on its own for me, but it wasn't until a slightly drunken conversation with Jay a couple of years later, after I went to visit him as our army duties had taken us to different places in the world, that he would mention something about the dreams. Obviously, I asked him what he meant, and he would describe the exact same nightmare for almost the exact same amount of time that I had experienced. And, well, that's pretty much it. I still have the dreams once in a while, but for whatever reason, it's always in that town, and I'm 100% certain that there is a mansion there somewhere, and something lives in it. Those events took place over 10 years ago now, and I have a different life now. I'm out of the army, and I am far too old and far too busy with family matters to do urban exploration anymore. But every now and then, I still think about it, and I get the bug to go and do it again. I think that thing, it wanted me to find the mansion and kept trying to get me to come back to it. Really, who knows, right? All I do know is that I will never be going back to that podunk little town. This felt truly like something out of a horror movie. I'm sharing this to look for possible answers of closure, and I have since told the police about this, and the police asked me why I didn't call them as it was happening. So me and my friend, we were in a dark car park by a lake in my city. The lake is surrounded by various car parks and trees, and the closer you get to the lake, the further you are from the main road, which takes you out of the wooded area. My friend and I were parked maybe 5 meters from the lake with the car facing the lake. We were sat there listening to music and just chatting for about 10 minutes, with me in the driver's seat but the ignition off. And all of a sudden my friend, who was looking out of my driver's side window, says to me, "Is that a man standing there?" I laugh and look ahead, and all I see is the dark lake in front of me, and so I say no. But he points his finger at my driver's side window. I turn my head and I see a man with a cat mask covering the top half of his face, standing about 10 meters away, staring at me and not moving. I immediately am extremely freaked out, as you can imagine. The way that he was standing and staring at us through the mask was so unnerving too. I immediately start my car as quick as I could, to which this man starts running towards my driver's side door at full speed. Thankfully, my doors were locked and he stood no chance against my car, but just as we breathed a sigh of relief that the car was now moving, we then see a white ute following closely behind my car. Now, as I've mentioned, we are in this wooded area with dirt roads and several turns which I was not familiar with. Each turn that we made, which were all wrong turns unfortunately, the car would follow us. We were screaming the whole way and not sure what they wanted from us. Eventually, the worst thing that possibly could have happened, and I make the wrong turn into a dead-end car park. The white ute parks on an angle, essentially blocking me in. At this point, I'm genuinely fearing for my life, and the masked man appears from the forest, coming at my car quickly. I drive around, nearly hitting him, and just manage to weasel past the ute parked on an angle. I finally drove out of there going the right way and getting back onto the main road. Now, the scariest part to me about all of this is wondering what they wanted from us. It felt like more than a prank, considering the whole car pursuit and attempted to block us in and all that. I don't know what kind of weapons they had in the car, but I'm pretty confident that there was something in there. I thought that it was possibly an attempted carjacking, but if that was the case, I feel like there would have been more efficient means of doing so, which says to me that they were up to something even worse than that. When I was around 10 or 11 years old, I had a friend whose house that I would stay at frequently. Now, there was one day in particular that my older sibling, my friend, and I had decided to have a sleepover where we all slept on the couch. The couch had this U-shaped layout, so my friend slept on the left side of the couch, I slept in the middle of the couch, and my sibling slept on the right side. My friend's house had this ledge-type area that looked into the kitchen, almost like diners have, and from where I was laying, I had the perfect view of the back door if I just propped myself up a bit. So, I woke up the earliest that morning, around 5 or 6, but it was summer, so the sun was just starting to rise. I could see outside pretty clearly at this point, when out of nowhere, not long after I woke up, I hear 3 knocks at the back door. Nothing weird about the knocks, other than the fact that it was on the back door at like 5 or 6 in the morning, but my friend's sibling was staying out in the garage, so my immediate thought was he must have locked himself out or something. I look up though, and there's nobody at the door. I even get up to look out the window better from a distance, and there's nobody there. I start to get a bit weirded out at this point, so I go lay back down and try to forget about it. But a minute or so later, there are 3 knocks again, but this time they're really slow. I look up and still nobody. I don't get up at this point because I'm pretty freaked out. Another minute goes by and I hear a sort of scraping sound, really long, eerie scrapes at the door, almost as if someone or something is dragging long nails down the door. This time I don't even look up because I'm about to soil myself. I sat there and listened for some time, but nothing happened after that, and I just still can't stop thinking, what was at that door? And what if I had opened it? Could that have just been a prank or something? It's been 8 years since then, and I still think about it a lot. I should add too that later on I asked my friend if her brother was out there to see if by chance it could have been him pulling a prank on us. But she confirmed that her brother was staying with his girlfriend. I wouldn't put it past her to lie, but still, she didn't seem to be lying, and honestly, I don't know what was going on that morning. This is actually my grandmother's story. So, my grandmother slept with her bedroom door closed and lamp on all the time. And one night, she woke up and saw an Asian woman in a green knit sweater standing at the foot of her bed staring at her. In typical Italian fashion, my grandmother began cursing and screaming for this woman to leave, as in the moment she didn't suspect a supernatural or anything, but had actually suspected that this strange woman had broken into her house. Keeping eyes on her, she got up out of bed and grabbed the woman by the wrists and began shaking her. She was screaming in her face to leave or she was going to call the police. She said that she could smell the lady's perfume though, and she was wearing what appeared to be a hospital bracelet on one of her wrists. The Asian lady didn't react to any of this and just sort of stared at her. Grandma backed away from what she thought now was a crazy person to her nightstand, where she turned for a brief moment to pick up the phone and dial 911, and when she turned to face the strange woman, she had just vanished. That's when she noticed that her bedroom door was still shut. She remained in her bedroom until the police arrived. They searched the entire house and found no signs of forced entry. After the police left, she realized that this woman was never looking at her, but was looking through her the entire time. My grandmother lived in this house for decades until her death. Other than this experience, the only other paranormal thing she would talk about was that she would get these whiffs of perfume or cigar smoke. This happened both before and after this incident, and I should note too that she was a smoker, although she certainly didn't smoke cigars. After her death, my family and I spent several days cleaning out her house. It was a rental, and as we did this, we too would get these whiffs of like perfume and cigar smoke all throughout that house. So, was it the paranormal or just residual smells from a woman who smoked and lived in that house for almost 40 years? Grandma's story is a bit creepy, but I don't know. Maybe she just hallucinated something that night. Or maybe she actually did see something. So where I live, there is a local folklore about a man-eating demon called a ghoul in our village. It is said that they live in graveyards and eat the flesh of dead humans who didn't live a righteous life. But sometimes they take the form of a beautiful woman or crying child, trying to attract people at night and eat them alive. It's a pretty well-known story. We've been hearing it since childhood, though I personally never believed it. I mean, jinns exist, but they can't hurt humans in normal circumstances. Now, one day, I went to see a performance in a neighboring village with my friend Aman. By the time the performance ended, it was almost midnight, so we started coming back home, and on the way back, we had to cross an old graveyard. It was one of the biggest paranormal hotspots in our village, apparently. We were just talking about the performance, though, the whole time until we reached said graveyard. Both of us became silent then, and we crossed this road many times, but never this late at night. Our bodies suddenly felt heavy as we crossed it. Every noise sort of felt paranormal, but that's just being on edge, right, out in the dark. Each step felt slower than the last, but suddenly we heard a really weird faint noise. As we walked down the road, the sound became louder and clearer, and we were certain that it was the cry of a child. I looked at Aman upon hearing that, and Aman was just as scared as I was, I think. As we slowly went closer to the sound, we did see a child about 1 or 2 years old crying beside the road. We didn't approach the child, we didn't even directly look at it. But as we walked by it, my eyes started tearing up a bit, and every inch of me was just telling me to run. I barely managed to keep my sanity at that moment, but I would have probably passed out if I was alone, I would guess. As we were walking past it, taking a wide berth, mind you, the crying became louder and louder, to the point like I felt my eardrum would burst. Once we were about 20 meters away from it, the crying just suddenly stopped. I could no longer control my body, and I ended up looking back. And when I did, I saw nothing. It was gone. There wasn't any sign of any kid or anyone else around us. I took a deep breath. My heart felt lighter. Aman looked at me, and he also looked relieved. But before we could say a single sentence, we heard what I can only describe as like a demonic scream. It came from somewhere in the darkness of the graveyard, but that was definitely the last straw for us. We ran as fast as we could, and I could feel my consciousness sort of slipping away as well. What I mean is that I felt sort of woozy and like I was about to go out. We didn't stop running though until we reached our village. There were a few people sitting beside a campfire playing some cards, and the moment that we saw them, I became, well, unconscious, I think. I just blacked out. I woke up in my grandparents' home. Aman had already woken up and he had told them everything. I confirmed his claims, and apparently what we saw was the ghoul. Some believed us and some didn't. Some are skeptical, as I was and still am to some degree. But I got an earful from my grandmother, and well, it's been about 3 years since that incident. We still talk about it every now and then when I go back to the village during vacations. And I still wonder what would have happened if I had been alone at that time. I mean, maybe I wouldn't be here telling you guys this incident. One thing is for sure though, I'm never ever using that road at night, ever again. A few years back, me and my friend were riding our motorcycles across country. If you've never done that and you get the opportunity, then you should take it. Anyway, we're both amateur storm chasers too, and love finding a safe dry spot to view thunderstorms from a safe distance from. On a motorcycle, it is a lot more dangerous and exciting, as you can probably imagine, but we were in Nebraska and I noticed on the radar that infamous hook where a potential tornado is. No sooner than I told my friend, the sirens in town started going off. The system was still about 15 minutes away, and so we decided to get behind the storm by going south into Kansas. The highway going south was maybe about a mile up the road, so we headed that way, and we were only about 20 miles from the border, but this storm system stretched all the way down to Oklahoma, so we knew that we'd be in for the rain eventually. We did get far enough away where we could stop and watch the lightning and the storm hit where we had been in Nebraska. And now, riding in the rain doesn't bother me too much. It's when there's severe weather that does. It was already getting dark and we started looking for shelter, a barn, gas station, or just something to get out of the pea-sized hail that was starting to fall. But we finally got up into this little town and saw what was, for all intents and purposes, an abandoned boarded-up building on the main drag. We found an awning to get under, and some scrap plywood that we used to lay over the bikes, and an old tire to put over the wood to keep it down. The wind, though, started blowing like mad, and started hailing again, some golf ball-sized hail this time. It was pretty intense, and the wind blowing the rain sideways, and the lightning was striking the ground all around us. The flimsy, what was left of an awning, wasn't keeping dry, but it was keeping the hail off of us, which we were grateful for. My friend was panicking though, saying that there was a radar indication that a tornado in the area was about to hit us, and if he had to break into the building to get out of the storm, he was going to. I was like, bro, we can't do that. I'm not trying to catch a criminal charge or anything. So we both sat there, hunkered down, when we heard what sounded like a deep growl. I tried to play it off, but then we heard and the best way that I can describe it is as a raspy voice say, "Come inside." He said, "Did you hear that?" And I said, "I sure as heck did." My heart was racing, but then we hear the same sounding voice, but this time it sounded like it was laughing. My friend was like, "Heck no, to heck with this." By this time the hail had stopped anyway, and it was still raining sideways, but we noped the heck out of there because I can assure you that there was nobody there, and where that voice came from, I still have no idea. The power was still out, and it was around 9:30 at night. We came up on a gas station, and it looked like the entire town was up under the gas station taking shelter. We managed to squeeze in and sheltered the rest of the storm out there. So we managed to squeeze in and we sheltered the rest of the storm out there. The power eventually came back on, and we talked to a few of the locals, and someone told us that the place used to be an inn, and the owner's wife ended up going insane and apparently killed her husband and several other men with a shotgun one night back in the 40s. I will say too that voice that we heard, it did sound a little bit female. So I figured that it's time to fully write out my experiences before they grow too fuzzy in my mind. It was a hot summer in Southern California, around 2007. My now ex-husband, our kids, and I lived a little over an hour from my in-laws' house, and for some reason that night we stayed at their home. It was my son, my husband, and I sleeping in a small room together. His kids were at their mum's nearby, and the house was a really old home in a historic district. It was a cute 3-bedroom home with no central heating or air, but my ex had told me about different hauntings in the house, like a little girl and some other things too. While I believe in the paranormal because of my own experiences, I still believe a good majority of things are people's imaginations, dreams, or mistaken ideas about why things happen. So I wasn't scared at all to sleep in the house. Anyway, I woke up in the middle of the night because I was outrageously hot. I went into the kitchen, turned on the lights, and got a drink of water in hopes of cooling down a bit. I normally sleep like a rock and can usually get right back to sleep when I've woken up, but no such luck that night. I drank some water in the kitchen and realized that I wasn't going to be able to go back to sleep that night, so I thought that I would just watch some TV until I got sleepy enough to try again. I wasn't worried about waking anyone up because the television was on the opposite end of the house anyway from the bedrooms. The kitchen, the front room, and the living room were in a sort of T formation in this house, the T being the walls that separated the rooms. The bottom left section of the T was where the kitchen was at, the bottom right of the T was the front room, and the top of the T was the living room. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, I began to walk out of the kitchen and into the living room towards the television. As I walked out of the kitchen, the wall connecting all 3 rooms was about 2 feet from my right side, when I hear a slam as if something had been thrown or hit my side of the wall. Not like someone hit the wall, but more like a small toy was thrown hard at the wall or something. It wasn't a large house by any means. I mean, there were no animals or children, or other than my son for that night. There was a doorway behind me that was really old, and it was definitely closed. It was kind of broken and was easily heard when you opened it though, because it didn't open easily. What I mean is that, either way, if something was thrown, it couldn't have come from the doorway because of the angle. I mean, it would have had to have gone right through me. Which means that the only direction that it could have come from was about 45 degrees directly in front of me from the direction of the television. which there are no doors or windows in that direction, and also nowhere for anyone to hide or anything. My point is that I don't know what the heck that was or how it could have made it past me without me seeing it. In any case, immediately after hearing whatever it was that hit the wall, I felt a rush past me, like a wind, but more like as if you could strongly feel the wind of somebody running past you. It came from the direction of whatever hit the wall towards the direction of the fireplace. The fireplace was about 4 feet to my left, and as it rushed past me, I immediately hear something hit the fireplace. I looked, but I didn't see anything. The whole thing took about 2 seconds, if that, but there was just no explanation for any of it. My heart jumped into my throat and I wanted to run. I don't like to acknowledge the paranormal because I believe it either gives them power or they know that they can now communicate with you, so they'll do more. So I tried to pretend that I wasn't scared out of my wits. I turned the light switch off calmly and slowly walked back to the bedroom. You know, sort of as if I changed my mind and no longer wanted to watch TV or anything. No big deal, right? Really inside though, I wanted to scream and run, but I wasn't going to give anything that satisfaction. I laid down next to my husband, tried to get as close to him as possible and cover myself up, especially my toes. Remember, it's like 85 degrees in the house, so covering myself up is pretty ridiculous because it is really hot. But I no longer cared about the heat. I was genuinely terrified of whatever just ran past me. So I laid there unable to sleep for at least 2 hours, my heart racing, terrified. And when I told him in the morning what happened, he just laughed and said, "I told you." Needless to say, we didn't sleep there again after that. So years ago, early 1990s, my wife and I rented a home in Kansas City through a lawyer who represented an elderly lady who had returned to where she grew up in Iowa following her husband's passing. One evening while I was home alone, I was putting away some towels in a linen closet in the upstairs hallway directly across from the bathroom. While I was in the closet, I had this strange feeling I was being watched from behind. I turned around and thought I saw an elderly gentleman. It totally freaked me out, but the whole thing was so strange I didn't say anything to my wife for fear of her laughing at me or potentially even scaring her. Anyway, a few months later, I'm downstairs watching a football game on a Sunday afternoon, and she's upstairs putting away towels in the linen closet when she screams and comes running downstairs. I ask her what happened, and she tells me that while she was putting away towels in the linen closet, she felt like she was being watched, and so she turned around and thought that she saw an old man standing there. She was shaking, mind you, while she was saying this. As I was comforting her, I told her the story of my extremely similar experience that I had been too creeped out to share with her for the reasons mentioned earlier. The next time I dropped off a rent check at the lawyer's office, I asked him if by chance he might share with me how the owner's husband had passed away. He told me that the gentleman had suffered a massive heart attack apparently at home and had died by the time that the paramedics arrived. He then asked me why I had inquired about the issue, and I told him that he wouldn't believe the story if I told him, but that I had a strangely odd sort of premonition that a man had died in the home and left it at that. Well, fast forward a few months and we returned home one evening to find out that we had arrived to a burglary in progress. 4 guys came running out of the house arms full, jumped into a van on the side street, a house was on a corner, and drove away. The insurance claim ended up being about $16,000, a fair amount considering it was the 90s. And after the final settlement check arrived, my insurance company cancelled our insurance, and my agent told me that the only thing that she could tell me was to move. She would say nothing more than that, and 4 months later, we had gone to bed very early and all the lights were off in the house, and we were awoken by another attempted break-in through the same entrance used for the first robbery. It stopped when we started turning the lights on, but We made some demands on the lawyer for the door and the lock improvements, as well as extra outdoor lighting and a security system as well. The estimates we received were about $2,400, and we offered to split the cost. We spoke to the owner and they declined to split the cost, but told us that we were free to do any of the work ourselves if we pleased, which we declined in the end. We terminated the lease and we ended up moving out. The home re-rented very quickly. It was a cute house, a cute neighborhood, just too close to a less desirable area, I suppose. So we were pretty fortunate that we only lost our security deposit in the end. As it turns out though, 2 young female lawyers had rented the house after us. About 9 months later, I received a phone call one evening from a woman asking if I had lived at the address. I told her that I had, and I asked her how she had gotten my name and my number. Turns out some mail with my name had arrived, despite the forwarding order, and I had the only name match in the area in the phone book. She begins to explain her story, which is that she and her partner had been robbed 3 times in the past 9 months, and in their subsequent arguments with the lawyer representing the landlord, he had let it slip that they must have been talking with the prior tenants when they presented a very similar set of demands for improvements to the home, and that's when she tracked me down. During our conversation, she mentioned, though, that they were constantly creeped out after moving in between the burglaries and the odd feeling that they were being watched all the time. Watched? Really? By who? I asked. And they just said to me, an old creepy guy. So I'm a skeptic of most things, except for ghosts and shared dreams and limited telepathy, the latter of which I actually believe is electrical signals and emotional closeness. But I have had a few very minor, uneventful experiences with ghosts. The first happened when I was about 8. I was alone in my father's house and he had gone out shopping. But both cats were outside and I was sitting in the computer room with my back to the door. Now, when I was a kid, I had this little sort of spongy miniature basketball that was the size of a baseball. I specifically remember that I'd left it by the cat tree in the lounge room, which was separated from the computer room by the dining room, and then the kitchen. However, after however long of silently sitting at the computer, I suddenly heard the ball thumping along the wooden floor like it was bouncing, and then it rolled and stopped against my foot. For some reason, I wasn't overly freaked out, but I was just completely perplexed as to how it could have even gotten there. The second event, though, was when I was about 13. I was staying at my grandmother's house while my mum was overseas. She was snoring in the room next to mine, like always, and I was awake reading fanfic on my flip phone. That's when I heard the front door open, and this was a very heavy, thick wooden door, mind you, that would scrape against the stone floor every time that it opened or closed, because the wood was warped and was now slightly too big for the frame. I shot out of bed and stood in the doorway, staring down the hallway towards the front door. I couldn't see it because it was around the next corner, but I stayed there watching to see if anyone walked past. Finally, completely beside myself, I went into my grandmother's room and woke her up, telling her that someone was in the house. She didn't believe me and went back to sleep, and this one is much more easily explained. I get that. It could have been a person, which is infinitely scarier than a ghost, to be honest, but they could have opened the door and been startled how loud it was, and maybe they fled. But what always trips me up is the fact that when I got up the next morning, after a very sleepless night, the door was closed. I only heard it open, and locked with the chain lock. Well, the third one was when I was 16. It was the night my grandmother died, and I was standing outside talking about her with my mum, her daughter, when a single lock of my hair stood up straight in the air like someone was holding it. Again, it could have been the wind, I suppose, but it was odd, that much is. So my family moved into a townhouse a little while ago. The building was roughly 3 decades old and sat directly across from a primary school with a regional medical clinic a short walk away. On paper, it was an ordinary residential location. I was a kid at the time, and from the beginning I had difficulty feeling settled there. I didn't describe it as fear back then, it was more a persistent awareness of being observed, I guess, even when I was alone. Now, one recurring issue involved hearing my name called all the time. It happened often enough that it became sort of routine for me. I would be in my bedroom or another part of the house and hear my mother call for me clearly, using the same tone that she always did. I would respond verbally, sometimes more than once, before realizing that nobody else was home. I checked the house each time, but there was never any indication that someone had entered or that I had misheard a nearby conversation or the television or anything like that. There was this one time, though, that I had come home from school earlier than usual and was alone in the house. I was in the kitchen preparing some food or something. The layout included a narrow partition wall separating the walkway from the counter area, and as I turned toward that wall, I saw what appeared to be my father's face leaning around the edge, as if he was partially concealed behind it. My reaction was immediate and a little bit casual, I would say. I spoke to him, assuming that he was joking, and when I blinked, the face was no longer there. At the time, I really didn't know what to make of it. I did note one detail, though, that felt incorrect even then. The eyes appeared uniformly sort of pale, without visible pupils or contrast. I didn't tell anyone about it. In the end, I just sort of thought that maybe I imagined it. Nothing escalated after that, but smaller incidences definitely continued throughout the years that we lived there. The feeling of being watched, that never diminished. The auditory experiences persisted intermittently, and despite this, I adapted and treated the house as uncomfortable rather than threatening. I eventually moved out without giving it too much thought, and more than a decade later, during a conversation with my sister back in 2023, the subject of our childhood home came up. She asked whether I had ever liked that townhouse, and when I asked why, she explained that she had experienced her own issues there, including unexplainable sounds and also a constant sense of unease. She said that this discomfort that had played a role in her decision to leave as soon as she became an adult. We compared details and realized that although our experiences were not identical, they certainly overlapped in tone and frequency. Our parents sold the house years ago and relocated to a rural property outside of the city. Neither my sister nor I have experienced similar issues in their current home or elsewhere ever since then. No unusual events followed us after leaving, which says a lot to me, really. I think that there was something in that house, and whoever bought it, well, I hope that they're doing okay. We moved into this house in late 2022, a single-story home with a converted loft in a quiet residential neighborhood. The house was pretty small, roughly 1,000 square feet with an open main floor and a staircase leading to 2 bedrooms and a small office. I personally work from home, so I spent most of my time in the house and am pretty familiar with its layout, mechanical systems, and the ambient noises that come with it. The first incident occurred within a few months of moving in, I would say. One night, my wife and I were watching television downstairs. I went upstairs to lie down while she stayed behind to clean up a little bit. I was awake and scrolling on my phone, lying on my side and facing away from the bedroom door. I heard someone enter the room, felt the mattress shift, and felt weight settle beside me. This was obviously consistent with my wife joining me, and so I didn't react. Within seconds, I heard the kitchen sink downstairs turn on, though, and metal dishes make contact in the basin. The overlap of these two events was immediately noticeable. I turned to my side expecting to see my wife, but the bed, it was empty. I called out to her and she answered from the kitchen. We talked it through and we couldn't identify a cause for this. At the time, I assumed I was just tired, and so I didn't dwell on it. Nothing similar happened for a long stretch after that too, and the incident, it mostly faded into the background. The second set of events occurred roughly a year later. My wife and I again had gone upstairs to bed at around 11 p.m. Our children were asleep and we'd been in bed for less than 10 minutes when a loud impact sound came from downstairs. One of our children's scooters moved across the hardwood floor in the dining area at the base of the stairs. The sound was not subtle or gradual. It was consistent with a forceful movement. Both of us reacted immediately and obviously assumed an intruder. I retrieved my firearm and we conducted a full search of the house, but there were no open doors, no disturbed entry points, and no signs of any people. We checked closets, storage spaces, the garage, everywhere, but nothing was out of place and no one was there. We returned upstairs, unsettled, but assuming that we must have just misinterpreted the sound. But less than 5 minutes later, we both heard clear footfalls ascending the stairs. The cadence was steady and the sound included fabric movement consistent with clothing. It took about the same amount of time that it would take an adult to climb the staircase normally. My wife moved toward the stairwell while I followed behind, expecting to confront someone at the top, but there was no one there. There was also no sound of retreat or anything too. Given the house layout as well, it just wouldn't have been possible for someone to reach the stairs like that, reverse direction, and disappear without being heard. We checked the house again in any case, but there was nothing. At that point, we turned on all the lights and we stayed downstairs for quite some time. Eventually, we returned to bed and closed a child safety gate at the top of the stairs as a bit of a precaution, I suppose. Not that it would stop anyone. It wasn't really for security so much as it was giving an audible warning, I guess, if something did move again. But about 30 minutes later, we then heard a mechanical noise coming from the upstairs office. When I approached the door, the sound intensified, and inside the room, my laser cutter's exhaust system was running at full output. The internal fan and the external vent fan were both engaged. This was weird too, because these are controlled by physical switches that require manual input, including multiple presses to reach maximum speed. And I had not used the machine in several months. We shut everything down and disconnected the power. And after that, the night ended without any further incidences. In the days that followed, we reviewed mundane explanations though. Obviously, electrical faults, vibration, obviously memory errors or overlapping sounds. None of them though fully accounted for the sequence or the timing, or the fact that we both heard them. I checked wiring as well, outlets and breaker logs, but nothing showed irregular behavior. Later I learned from neighbors though that a previous occupant had left abruptly years earlier under unclear circumstances. No crime was documented, no investigation followed, and that information, it didn't provide any answers, and I don't attribute the events to it or anything, but it is a little bit weird. What ultimately mattered though was not identifying a cause, but addressing the stress response that it created in both of us. We installed interior cameras, reinforced nightly routines, and limited speculation because we were just sort of going crazy over it all. Over time, the activity didn't repeat, thankfully, and sleep normalized. The house returned to its normal, predictable behavior, I guess you could say, and I really don't know what happened that night, but it was strange. If something like that were to happen again, I think that I would document it now, address safety first, I guess, and involve professionals where appropriate too. But until then, it remains an incident without much of an explanation, and I guess that that's realistically where it's going to stay. I was enrolled in a performing arts program at a regional university some years back. During my second year there, my partner and I rented a small apartment off of campus. It was inexpensive by local standards, and located in a concrete residential block built in the late 1990s. By the winter of 2024, we had lived there for almost 2 full academic years without incident. The apartment layout was pretty simple. The entrance opened directly into a combined living and dining area. A narrow corridor led to the bedroom and the kitchen, with a small bathroom between them. My computer desk faced the wall opposite the hallway, meaning the corridor was always within my peripheral vision while I worked or played video games. And over several weeks, I began noticing brief movement in that hallway. It was never fully formed or clearly defined, just sort of short, dark shapes passing quickly from one side to the other. The movement was always low to the ground and lasted less than a second. Each time I turned to look directly, there was nothing there too. I attributed the whole thing to just fatigue or screen strain from gaming or something. Just normal visual processing errors, I guess. I didn't mention it to my partner because she's easily unsettled, and I had no confidence that what I was actually noticing was even meaningful. But the more significant incident occurred during preparation for a student film project that I was working on. A classmate had cast me in a short production that required an early morning call time. At that point in time in the semester, my sleep schedule had deteriorated completely as well. I was staying awake most nights and sleeping through the afternoon. Adjusting on short notice was pretty unrealistic, but it had to be done. I had access to a prescribed sedative that I had used occasionally in the past for travel-related insomnia, so I took one dose at about 6:30, expecting uninterrupted sleep throughout the night. I fell asleep quickly too. At around 9:45 p.m., I woke up from something. I was fully alert, not disoriented at all, and immediately aware of my surroundings. My partner was awake beside me, lying on her side and using her phone. The room lighting was minimal, coming only from the screen, and as my eyes adjusted, I noticed what appeared to be a human form positioned over her. It was oriented vertically, knees on the mattress, torso leaning forward. The outline suggested an elderly person based on posture and proportions. There were no sharp details, no clear facial features or clothing, but the shape was distinct enough to register as a figure rather than a shadow or reflection. My first attempt was that I was still partially dreaming when I woke up. However, I was able to speak and move slightly and register my partner's presence clearly. I verbalized a short, incomplete sentence out of reflex, and when my partner responded, I attempted to focus directly on what I was seeing. At that moment, my attention fully locked onto the figure, and it ceased to be visible. There was no motion away from the bed or change in the lighting or anything. It just simply was no longer present. The space above my partner was now empty. In the end, I chose not to describe what I had seen. I told her nothing was wrong, and I encouraged her to continue resting. My reasoning was just practical, I guess. If this was a transient hallucination linked to medication, stress, or sleep interruption, escalating it would just serve no purpose. So, later that night I checked the time and noted that less than 4 hours had passed since taking that sedative, which was very unusual based on prior use. I experienced no further disturbances that evening or that night, and so I really don't know what that was. Since moving out, I've not experienced anything similar, and I remain open to neurological or pharmacological explanations, but what I will say is that the medication that I took, it's never made me experience anything like this before, and as far as I know, it really shouldn't make anyone experience anything like this. I try not to think about it too much these days, and really, I was just glad to be out of there and to not have to go back. So this incident took place during a period when I spent a lot of time driving at night for no particular reason, other than habit really, but I wanted to share this because it's one of the few experiences in my life that I've really never been able to solve through ordinary explanation, despite revisiting it many, many times. So at the time, I was living in central Alberta, Canada, in an area dominated by farmland and sparsely populated service towns. I was dating someone then, and it was common for us to take long drives late in the evening. We worked pretty irregular hours, and driving after dark was quiet, predictable, and usually uneventful. On the night in question, we had been driving for about over an hour at this stage. The time was somewhere between 10:30 and midnight, though I cannot be more precise than that. Traffic was minimal, weather conditions were very stable, and visibility was clear aside from the expected darkness outside of the reach of the streetlights. We exited a provincial highway to pass through a small agricultural settlement at one stage, the type consisting of a grain elevator, a few houses, and one intersecting road. There were no businesses open, no pedestrians, and no other vehicles present. As we approached the intersection where the road rejoined the highway, we slowed to a complete stop, because that was when we saw it. Positioned directly in the centerline of the highway, straddling the double yellow markings, was an animal, roughly equivalent in size to a large dog or maybe a small wolf. Its body posture was upright and balanced though, not crouched or defensive. It was facing our vehicle head-on, and what immediately stood out was its lack of movement. When I say that it didn't flinch, shift its weight, or turn its head as we rolled to a stop less than a car length away, I mean that it was like a statue. At first, I assumed that whatever it was injured or disoriented. However, there were no visible signs of distress, and its back was straight, its head level, and its limbs appeared stable. The fur was dark, somewhere between deep brown and charcoal, and appeared very uneven in texture, as if clumped or thinned in places, rather than uniformly shedding. As our headlights passed directly over this thing, I noticed something that triggered a strong sense of unease in me. There was no visible eye reflection. In my experience, even domestic animals produce some degree of light return when illuminated directly at night. In this case, the eyes remained flat and dark, without glint or shine or anything. The animal continued to stare at the vehicle without reacting. My partner hesitated before turning onto the highway. He did not accelerate quickly, and he didn't look away from it until we were fully past the intersection, but neither of us spoke immediately. Mind you, there was no sense of relief after passing it, which was pretty unusual, but instead I guess there was concern that it might move, follow, or behave unpredictably once we had turned our backs to it. Rather than driving directly back toward my residence too, we continued along the highway in the opposite direction for some time. We drove several additional miles and made a loop through a larger town, and waited before retracing our route. This decision was not discussed explicitly, but it was pretty clear that we were both attempting to put distance between ourselves and whatever that was. Throughout that time, we discussed possible explanations as well. Coyotes were common in the region, but their behavior did not match what we had observed. Wolves were rare and typically avoided vehicles. Domestic dogs, they didn't usually sit calmly in the center of an active highway at night, nor would they remain motionless under lights like that. When we eventually passed the intersection again, the animal was no longer there. There were no tracks or road disturbances visible from the car or anything that we could see. We never did report the incident as, well, there was just no immediate threat and nothing tangible to describe beyond an unusual animal sighting. And look, I'm not asserting that the encounter involved anything outside of known wildlife behavior. However, it just didn't align with any animal interaction that I've experienced before or since. And what remains most notable to me is not actually the appearance itself. Instead, it's the animal's complete, just lack of reaction and the instinctive response that it triggered in both of us. The event, it was over pretty quickly and nothing further occurred that night. But still, it stands out as a moment where I just don't really have an explanation for it. And that unresolved gap is the reason that it has remained fixed in my memory long after any other more dramatic experience has faded. At the time that this happened, I was visiting a close friend who was attending university in Northern California, near the Monterey Bay area. A small group of us from our hometown met up with her for a brief stop before continuing south for a longer trip, and the plan was pretty casual. Stay one night near campus, then travel to San Diego County for several days. There were 6 of us, all women, and we rented a single vehicle for convenience. The drive south was pretty uneventful. The problems began only when we checked into the short terminal rental that we had booked for 2 nights. So the house was located in a densely populated but poorly maintained residential area near a major road. Entry required unlocking a metal gate secured with a combination lock, after which a narrow driveway led to the house. The property had a detached storage structure at the rear that was listed as off-limits. The yard was pretty overgrown, and visibility from the street was pretty limited by the fencing and the vegetation. All doors technically functioned, but none felt particularly secure by any means. Inside, the layout was simple. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a combined kitchen-living area, and an enclosed front sitting space with large windows. We used that area frequently during that evening, because it was separated from the rest of the house and felt sort of semi-private, I guess. Now, on the final night of our stay, something occurred that we initially dismissed as background noise. You see, while we were sitting there near the front of the house, we heard a sort of metal movement near the gate, consistent with a chain or maybe a latch being disturbed. No one investigated immediately, and after a short discussion, we sort of went back inside and locked the doors again. Most of the group went to bed between about 11 o'clock and midnight, and one person stayed awake in her room video chatting with someone back home. Another friend reminded us later about studying, and I went to sleep shortly after midnight, I think. Now, I must have woken up sometime at around 2:30 in the morning by someone shaking my shoulder and telling me, quietly but urgently, that something was wrong. At first, I assumed it was anxiety or maybe confusion, but I followed her into the living room where several others were now gathered, visibly distressed. Before anyone explained, we all heard distinct movement coming from the kitchen area. It wasn't a single noise, mind you, but a sequence. Light impacts, shifting objects, and what sounded like drawers being opened and closed. Nobody was speaking at that point. The source was not visible from where we were standing, but at that moment, the situation shifted from confusion to threat assessment immediately. We woke the remaining people, consolidated into one bedroom, and barricaded the door with available furniture. 2 of us stayed positioned near the door while others contacted emergency services. And while waiting, we heard additional sounds consistent with footsteps moving between the rooms. These were not constant, but intermittent, and the sounds didn't respond to us making noise, calling out, or deliberately knocking on the walls or anything. And that absence of reaction was a bit disturbing, to be honest. Law enforcement arrived after a significant delay. Entry required one of us to unlock the door from the inside. The officers conducted a brief sweep of the interior and stated that they found nothing. Their inspection appeared limited, and they initially declined to check the yard or detached structure, but after insisting, they performed a cursory exterior check and no forced entry was identified. No items were reported missing, and the officers suggested that the possibility of an animal or maybe just misinterpretation, and they left. None of us accepted that explanation, though, and within an hour we decided that we should leave. So we packed quickly and we began driving back north before dawn rather than staying another night, and no one slept during the drive. In the days following, we attempted to sort of reconstruct the timeline and maybe identify some plausible cause. The most likely explanation remains unauthorized entry by a person familiar with the property or something. Possibly somebody accessing the yard or the structure and leaving before police arrived. A lack of confrontation does not negate that possibility, I suppose, but in hindsight, our presence may have deterred escalation rather than inviting it, I guess. But since that trip, my behavior around shared lodging has changed dramatically. I now inspect entry points immediately, carry additional locking devices, and avoid properties with isolated layouts or unsecured exterior structures. And also, while I don't frame the incident as paranormal, I cannot rule that out either because, really, the person should have been there when the police arrived. It was weird, and nothing followed us after that, and no further incidents occurred on the trip. But still, the experience has sat with me all these years, and it's weird how quickly a familiar environment can become unsafe without any warning. At the time that this happened, I was studying in northern Austria, enrolled at a public university, and serving in a student coordination role responsible for organizing orientation activities for incoming students. The first weeks of the semester were always demanding, involving early mornings, logistical planning, and really, really long days on campus. But I was living alone in a privately owned residential building that was not officially designated as student housing, but was largely occupied by students due to its low rent. The building also housed long-term tenants, short-term ones, and individuals whose backgrounds were unknown to most residents. The structure itself was pretty outdated and poorly maintained, but it was good enough for me. Now, each floor was divided into sort of two corridors, separated by a heavy fire door accessed from the stairwell. This door produced a distinct, high-pitched noise when opened, which made it pretty easy to track movement on the floor. The hallway lights were permanently on here, and my apartment was a single-room unit with a bathroom, bed, desk, and a kitchenette, all arranged in pretty close proximity. The front door was pretty thin, and the peephole was unusually large compared to modern standards. Anyway, on the morning in question, I woke up shortly before 5 in the morning to prepare some food for an orientation event. After showering, I stood at my desk mirror applying some makeup. My apartment door was less than a meter to my left, while the rest of the room was extended to my right. And at some point, I heard the corridor door open. This was not unusual by any means. Residents often return late here, especially during the first weeks of term. Normally, such movement would be followed by the sound of an apartment door opening and closing within seconds. But that sound never came, which was a bit weird. Several minutes passed, and I became aware of the absence rather than the presence of noise, I guess, and the corridor was just completely silent. I continued what I was doing, but my attention had definitely shifted. I noticed a physical response too. I had light dizziness all of a sudden, tension in my shoulders, and a growing sense of alertness that I didn't experience here ever before. I turned my head toward the apartment door. The peephole, which normally showed a bright, distorted view of the hallway, was now completely dark. There was no ambiguity about what that indicates too. Someone or something was directly blocking it. At that moment, I stopped moving. I didn't approach the door or the light switch, which was mounted beside the frame. Instead, I stepped backward toward the bed and sat down against the wall where the door was no longer visible. From that position, anyone trying to look under the door or something would not have a direct line of sight into the room. I waited, and I didn't check my phone or make any noise. I didn't really know how long this lasted, but it felt extended enough to be deliberate rather than accidental. Eventually, I heard the corridor door open again and then close. The sound was pretty clear again. I waited a little bit longer, and when I finally approached the door, I listened before opening it. There were no footsteps or voices, and so I unlocked it, opened it slowly, and found the hallway empty. As I exited the building minutes later, I noticed an unfamiliar man standing near the front entrance. He appeared to be waiting rather than passing through, I suppose, but we made brief eye contact. There was no verbal exchange. His expression was neutral, not startled or evasive or anything. And only later did I consider the practical explanation for what all of this meant. You see, from the street it was possible to see when individual apartments were lit, and someone familiar with the building layout could identify which door corresponded to which unit. The peephole design allowed a clear interior view as well from the outside, at least a little bit, and it was always magnified rather than obscured, I guess you could say, but out of curiosity, days later I tested it myself. Standing in the corridor, I could see nearly the entire room through that peephole, including facial details and even hand movements. Anyone positioned there, they would have been able to observe me clearly and would have known exactly when I noticed. I was on edge for some time after that, but thankfully nothing similar happened again. That certainly didn't make the incident insignificant, as what was that guy doing there and why? But still, thankfully I finished my studies there without incident again, and I guess it was just one of those one-off things. So I had just gotten my driver's license in India and was still adjusting to driving longer distances. That evening, I planned to pick up my friend Priya, who had recently relocated to a different part of Chennai for work. It was already around 10:15 in the afternoon when I left, and the city had begun to quieten down a bit. My route took me near the Gindi Reserve Forest, a dense patch of protected land here, and I had driven past it during the day many times, and I never even considered it dangerous. At night, however, the isolation was striking. Priya and I were about halfway to my house when we noticed a figure at the edge of the road. Initially, I thought it was somebody in trouble. The man was bent over a damaged motorcycle by the looks of things, clutching his leg and sort of moaning softly too. My first instinct was to stop and try to help this guy, but something about the whole situation just felt off. Before I could process it further, movement caught my eye from the forest lining both sides of the road, and within seconds, several men appeared, emerging silently from the trees. Each of them were carrying a curved blade, and their posture, it wasn't casual. They were advancing deliberately toward the car. My adrenaline immediately surged. I didn't have time to reason. I pressed the accelerator and drove straight through the stretch, keeping my headlights on full beam. The men followed briefly, but the trees eventually obscured them. Once the forest cleared, I stopped to catch my breath a little bit. Priya sat silently, her hands gripping the seat. We both understood that we had narrowly avoided a direct confrontation, and I realized then, too, that the man by the motorcycle, he was the lure, a way to slow drivers down. Stopping could have seen us killed that night. After we reached a populated area, I explained the situation to my parents. They confirmed that this section of the forest had a history of criminal activity, particularly targeted travelers at night. They noted that couples or even pairs traveling together were especially vulnerable. Driving past without exiting the car had likely prevented a violent encounter for us, and for that, I am thankful. So, to anyone traveling alone through remote areas at night, my advice: stay alert, avoid unnecessary stops, and be aware that danger can appear in forms that seem ordinary at first glance. I will never forget the way that the forest fell so silent, except for those few figures emerging from the shadows. And I also know that I will never take that stretch again. I never really thought of my job as risky. At 19, I was working late shifts at a large warehouse retailer, close enough to home that the drive never felt like a concern at all. The store environment was pretty busy, predictable, and sort of familiar, I guess. I trusted the people that I worked with too, and That sense of routine is part of why I didn't recognize a problem immediately, I think. During the cleanup period, following a major seasonal sales event, the store had closed to customers, but the floor was still in disarray. I was assigned to straighten and restack apparel tables near the back half of the sales floor, and while working, I noticed a man standing several aisles away. He wasn't browsing, and he was stationary and oriented sort of toward me. At the time, I assumed he was waiting for assistance or unsure where to go or something, which was common during the closing procedures. So I approached him and asked whether he needed some help finding a size or an item or something. His response was hesitant and unusually high in pitch, but not overtly alarming or anything. I retrieved the item that he requested, and instead of disengaging afterward, he remained nearby and initiated personal conversation. He commented on my appearance and asked about my background, and attempted to continue the interaction beyond anything work-related. I didn't challenge this directly. I was pretty tired, I guess, focused on just finishing my shift, and incorrectly assessed him as socially awkward rather than threatening. Anyway, as closing announcements began, he asked for my social media contact. I provided it with no intention of follow-up. In hindsight, though, this was a huge lapse in judgment, driven by exhaustion and also misplaced politeness. After the store cleared, I met with a coworker that I trusted near the employee exit. I mentioned the interaction casually and told her the name that he had given me. Her reaction changed immediately, though. She asked to see his profile, and after a brief look, she contacted a supervisor without explanation. What followed was a structured questioning process. Management asked for a physical description, the nature of his comments, and whether he had approached me alone. Only then was I informed that the man was known to the store. Apparently, he was a former employee, dismissed after repeated boundary violations involving another staff member or something. According to management, he had monitored work schedules, returned to the store outside of business necessity, and continued contact despite being told to stop. Policy changes, including the removal of printed schedules, had been implemented just because of him. At that point, the situation was reframed for me. This was not a single uncomfortable interaction. It fit an established pattern with this guy. I was escorted to my vehicle that night. While standing with my supervisor and co-worker in the parking lot, I received a message from him asking whether I lived nearby and whether I was alone. Under instruction, I replied that I lived with others and declined further contact. I blocked him once I was home, and honestly, I thought that was that. Out of concern rather than curiosity, I reviewed publicly available information about him too. He appeared to have a spouse and children, I think. I considered reaching out, but was advised that a previous attempt by another employee had been dismissed and caused additional distress without resolution, apparently. In the weeks that followed, he returned repeatedly too. He came during different shifts and asked for me by name. Each time, co-workers redirected me to non-public areas. This became an informal but coordinated response. Walkie-talkies, temporary reassignment, and silent signals when he entered the building. No announcement was ever made over the system, but awareness spread organically among the staff, I think. One incident, though, stands out above everything. So, I was crossing departments when I noticed him ahead of me at one point. Before I could change direction, a co-worker signaled urgently, and I moved into the jewelry department and took cover behind the counter, while an older associate engaged him. He asked whether a specific employee from apparel was working that day, describing me in terms that reduced me to age and ethnicity. My co-worker denied that I was there and maintained conversation until he left the department, and I remained out of sight for over an hour afterward. The most difficult aspect was uncertainty outside of the building, though, because on several nights an unoccupied vehicle remained parked with lights off until I exited. I cannot confirm that it was him, but The pattern aligned too closely to ignore it for sure. So I adjusted my schedule, varied my exit routes, and avoided leaving alone whenever possible. After approximately 5 months of doing this as well, the visits, they finally stopped. Mind you, no explanation was ever given and the behavior just simply ceased. I never pursued legal action too because at that age, I just lacked the clarity and the emotional bandwidth to escalate the situation beyond immediate safety, I guess. Instead, I relied on collective awareness and informal protection from co-workers, which was good enough, I suppose, but in hindsight, I probably should have done more. What stayed with me, though, was not the fear in the moment, but the delayed understanding of just how easily my environment could change like that. The experience definitely changed me and how I assess people, personal boundaries, workplace dynamics, all of that. And thankfully, like I said, it seemed like eventually he just gave up, but still, every now and then I still find myself looking over my shoulder and wondering if maybe he'll come back one day. I sure hope not. In the early 1980s, my mother and her siblings lived with their parents in a sort of row-style duplex in southern Ontario, outside of Hamilton. The building, it dated back several decades and had been modified repeatedly over the years. Both units shared a continuous basement with a low-crawl corridor running beneath the dividing wall. The space was pretty unfinished, packed dirt floor, exposed joists, and uneven wooden supports. Access was through a loose panel near the laundry area. The adults did not use the space for storage at that time, and as a result, the children treated it as a bit of a play area. They brought down flashlights, old toys, and pieces of cardboard and spent long stretches of time there, especially during the winter months. According to everybody involved, the crawl space had been cleared beforehand and was not a place where items were regularly added or removed or anything. And at some point during this period, while moving dirt near the back section of the crawl corridor, the children uncovered a floorboard made of compressed cardboard, printed with letters and symbols. It was not in packaging and showed signs of age and moisture exposure. None of the children recognized it immediately, but an older sibling identified it as a spirit board after seeing the alphabet layout. No one admitted to bringing it into the house, and there was no obvious reason that it could have been buried under the dirt floor like that. Despite limited understanding of what it was, the children experimented with it briefly, treating it like a game rather than a ritual. This ended quickly, though, once their mother became aware of it. She was strict, religious, and not inclined to investigate or debate anything. She removed the board immediately, cut it into sections using household scissors, and disposed of the pieces into separate trash bags. She also restricted access to the crawl space for several days afterward. Now, the matter would likely have ended there if not for what happened later that week. When the children were allowed back into the basement, they returned to the crawl space, and near the same rear section where the board had originally been found, they noticed a single piece of printed cardboard resting on top of the dirt. It was dry, intact, and not buried. The fragment contained one large printed character, the capital letter I. Mind you, this was not noticed all at once. One child pointed it out, assuming someone had dropped it. Then others denied it, and when their mother was shown the fragment, she recognized the font and the color immediately as part of the original board. She searched the basement trash bins and outdoor garbage containers, but didn't find the remaining pieces. From a practical standpoint, several explanations were considered later: that a piece had been missed during the disposal, that maybe an animal had dragged it back inside, or that it had fallen from another unit through the shared structure. But none of these explanations fully satisfied the adults in the end, especially at the time, particularly because the crawl space had no direct exterior access and the fragment showed no dirt or tearing consistent with being moved mechanically like that. The mother interpreted the fragment symbolically rather than literally. She didn't think of it as a paranormal thing or anything, but just as evidence that the object itself had not been fully removed in the end. Her reaction was pretty procedural. She contacted a local priest, had the basement blessed, and sealed off the crawl space permanently using plywood and some screws. Life in the house continued, but my mother later reported a persistent sense of unease tied specifically to that basement afterward. She also described hearing what she described as like a knocking sound coming from the floors beneath her feet. Mind you, there should not have been anyone down there, and she described it as if somebody had taken like a broomstick and just started bashing the floor above them. She also said that at times she could have sworn that she saw the lights being turned on down there, but there was no one down there, so she didn't know how that was even possible. The laundry was always done quickly after that. The sealed panel was also never reopened. Years later, though, when the house was sold, contractors discovered remnants of like old printed cardboard embedded in the dirt beneath the sealed area, all over the place apparently. By then, most of it had deteriorated, so they couldn't tell what it was, but that original incident had already become fixed in the family memory, and so they assumed that maybe it was more Ouija boards or something like that. Now, whether that was the case or not is hard to say, but still, it was simply an object that appeared where it should not have been, and weird things happened afterward that the family had never experienced before, which is a little bit odd, right? So, I'm not presenting this as like proof of anything supernatural, paranormal, or otherwise. It's just simply an account of an event that didn't line up with what I could reasonably explain, then or now, and I thought that I should share it. So, this occurred in the early 2000s when I was in middle school, in a suburban area outside of Iowa. One of my closest friends, her name was Emily, lived in a residential development that had been built near land that used to be farmland, and also some wooded acreage too. Local stories circulated about the area having a long history, including displaced settlements and old cemeteries, but there were more community rumors than documented facts, I guess you could say. Emily's house was large though, well maintained and occupied by a pretty stable family. Her mother worked from home and was a very routine-oriented sort of person. Her father traveled frequently for work, and the house itself didn't appear neglected or unstable in any way. I spent many weekends there over several years, often staying overnight for school-related activities or group sleepovers. I was familiar with the layout too, the daily routines of the family, and the sounds and the ins and outs of the house. Now one night, Emily hosted a sleepover with several friends. Her father was away on a business trip, which was pretty common and known to everybody present. We set up sleeping arrangements in Emily's bedroom using air mattresses and sleeping bags. I ended up positioned sort of closest to the bedroom door, which was left open as it always was at night. At the top of the staircase outside of her room, the family kept a large floor fan running continuously. The stated purpose was airflow and ambient noise, but it also masked normal household sounds, I guess. Now, I had difficulty falling asleep that night. I was fully awake and aware and not drifting in and out or anything, just sort of bored, I guess. When at some point I distinctly heard a bedroom door open across the hall, followed by footsteps moving toward the stairs. The sound pattern was pretty familiar to me, actually. The hallway floor creaked in predictable places, and two of the stair treads produced consistent noise regardless of how lightly they were stepped on. I heard those exact sounds in sequence too, followed by footsteps descending. Based on the timing, context, and the absence of any other adults in the house, I assumed it was Emily's mother going downstairs. This didn't alarm me at the time, obviously. Morning routines often started early in that house after all. But later, still awake, I began hearing activity down in the kitchen. Cabinet doors, utensils, and general movement, consistent with food preparation, I guess. Again, this sort of matched what I expected Emily's mother to do, cooking breakfast every time that I stayed over, and the sounds were pretty familiar. So at that point, I assumed it was early morning, though I had no way to check the time. What caused concern for me, though, was the delay. The kitchen sounds continued intermittently for a long period, and eventually, daylight became visible through the windows, and I sort of shifted position so that I could see the staircase clearly, expecting Emily's mother to come back upstairs to wake everyone. But instead, I eventually saw her emerge from her bedroom across the hall and walk towards the stairs for the first time that morning. Now, I want to be clear that there is no confusion